I am Leon, 69 years old, and for 4 decades I made my living with a wrench in my hand and dirt under my fingernails. My daughter and her husband always looked down on me, seeing only a tired old plumber. Last week they barged into my home demanding I move to the basement so they could take over my house. When I told them no, my son-in-law lost his mind. He picked up a solid oak chair and hurled it right at me. The wood shattered against my face, leaving me bleeding on my own living room floor. My daughter did not help me. Instead, she screamed that I was being selfish. I did not yell back. I simply walked out, got into my truck, and texted my lawyer. Phase 1 is complete. Call the police. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a harsh lesson about respect. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when the peace of my quiet Atlanta suburb was shattered. The front door swung open with a violent bang that echoed through the hallway. Before I could even get up from my armchair, my daughter Jada and her husband Brad stomped into the living room. They did not say hello. They did not ask how my day was. Instead, they dropped 4 massive designer suitcases right onto my hardwood floor. The heavy thud made the floorboards rattle. Brad, a 36-year-old venture capital consultant who always wore suits that cost more than my first truck, looked around my living room with a sneer. Jada crossed her arms and looked at me with an expression of pure entitlement. "Dad, we are moving in," she announced as if she were ordering a coffee. "Brad needs to be closer to the city for a new project, and our penthouse is undergoing some renovations. We are taking the master bedroom. You need to clear your things out by tonight and move down to the basement." I sat there, my hands resting on my knees, staring at the two of them. I had spent 40 years building commercial plumbing systems across this state, working 60-hour weeks to ensure my daughter never had to struggle. My hands are permanently scarred and calloused from decades of threading iron pipes and welding copper, but those hands paid for her expensive private college. Those hands paid for her extravagant wedding to a man who refused to even shake them properly the first time we met, opting for a weak nod and a disgusted glance at my work boots. I looked at Brad, who was already inspecting my crown molding with a look of absolute disdain. "No," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You are not taking my bedroom and you are not moving in." Brad whipped his head around his face, instantly turning a splotchy red. "Excuse me," he snapped, stepping toward me. "We are not asking, Leon. We are telling you. We need the space and you are just one old man taking up a 4-bedroom house. It is ridiculous." I stood up slowly, planting my feet on the ground. "This is my house, Brad. If you need a place to stay, you can rent a hotel. You are not displacing me in my own home." Brad lost whatever little composure he had. He started cursing, calling me an ignorant old laborer who did not understand how the real world worked. His rage boiled over in a second. He grabbed the heavy oak chair sitting next to the dining table, lifted it high, and hurled it directly at my head. I raised my arm, but I was not fast enough. The heavy wood crashed into the side of my face and shoulders, splintering against the wall behind me. A sharp, blinding pain shot through my skull, and I stumbled backward, clutching my cheek. I felt the warm, thick liquid immediately pooling in my hand and dripping down my chin. Blood. I was bleeding in the house I had built, struck by a man who thought I was nothing but dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. I looked over at Jada, expecting my daughter, the child I had raised and loved, to scream at her husband, to rush to my side to ask if I was okay. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes wide, not with concern, but with deep irritation. "Look what you made him do, Dad!" she yelled, her voice dripping with venom. "You are being completely selfish. We are your family and you cannot even do us this one simple favor. Brad is under a lot of stress at work and you are just making it worse. You are so stubborn and greedy." Her words hurt far more than the physical blow. She was looking at my bleeding face and defending the man who had just assaulted me. I looked down at the shattered pieces of the oak chair scattered across the floor. That was not just any piece of furniture. When I was 22 years old, fresh out of an apprenticeship, and taking my very first commercial plumbing contract, I spent an entire month crawling through industrial sewer pipes. I came home every night smelling like waste and bleach, my muscles aching so badly I could barely sleep. With my first real paycheck, I bought a dining set for my late wife, Evelyn. It was the first nice thing we ever owned. Evelyn polished those oak chairs every Sunday. She cherished them, telling everyone they were a symbol of our hard work and our enduring promise to each other. When she passed away 5 years ago, those chairs became sacred to me. and now Brad had smashed one of them against my face because I refused to surrender my bed to him. He destroyed a piece of my history, a piece of Evelyn, without a second thought. He was completely ignorant of its emotional value, just as he was utterly ignorant of my actual financial value. He always assumed I was just a broke retiree living off a meager pension. He had no idea that the calloused old plumber he was abusing held an 8-figure commercial contracting empire entirely in a blind trust. Brad stood there, his chest heaving, pointing a finger at me. "You better have your bags packed and moved to the basement by the time we get back from dinner," he barked, straightening his designer jacket as if he had just swatted a fly. "If you do not, I will throw your garbage out on the lawn myself." I did not reach for a towel. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse or yell or try to strike him back. I simply stood up completely straight, letting the blood drip freely from my cheek onto the collar of my shirt. I looked Brad dead in the eyes. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy, thick, and suffocating. Brad shifted his weight, his arrogant sneer faltering for just a fraction of a second as he met my gaze. He expected an old, tired man to cower, to cry, or to throw a useless tantrum. He did not expect the absolute terrifying stillness of a man who had suddenly flipped a switch in his mind. I looked at Jada, my daughter, the girl Evelyn had begged me to protect. "Do not ever let Jada fall into the hands of a con artist," Evelyn had told me on her deathbed. I was looking right at the con artist, and I realized I had been too soft. I had let them mistake my quiet humility for weakness. I did not say a single word to either of them. I just stared until Brad looked away, muttering under his breath about how he needed a drink before they went out. Without a backward glance, I turned around and walked out the front door. I climbed into my pickup truck, the leather seat cold against my back, and started the engine. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The gash on my cheek was deep, definitely requiring stitches, and my shirt was stained crimson. I drove straight toward the hospital emergency room. With my good hand, I pulled out my phone and opened my messages. I selected the contact for Richard Thorne, my attorney. Richard was not some cheap local lawyer you call for a traffic ticket. He was a high-powered corporate attorney who managed my multi-million-dollar trusts and federal tax strategies with the ruthless precision of a surgeon. He had been waiting for my signal for weeks, ever since I first suspected Brad was drowning in hidden financial ruin. I typed a short, deliberate message. "Phase 1 is complete. Call the police." I hit send, placed the phone on the passenger seat, and drove toward the emergency room, knowing that the trap I had been carefully setting was finally springing shut. Brad thought he had just bullied a helpless old man. He did not realize he had just handed me the legal leverage to destroy his entire life. I sat in the sterile waiting room of the emergency department, pressing a blood-soaked gauze pad against my cheek. My face throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the security application connected to my home. I had recently upgraded the entire system to high-definition commercial-grade cameras, the kind I used to install in corporate warehouses. Through the glowing screen, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my living room. Brad and Jada had not touched a single piece of my belongings. They had not started packing my things for the basement. Instead, Brad was lounging comfortably in my favorite leather recliner, his designer shoes propped up on my mahogany coffee table. In his hand, he held a crystal glass filled with a deep red liquid. He had actually gone down into my private cellar and opened a bottle of vintage French Bordeaux I had been saving for a special occasion. He was laughing, talking animatedly to Jada, likely boasting about how easily he had put the old man in his place. I watched his arrogant smile stretch across his face, but that smile did not last long. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door violently burst open, the frame splintering inward. The red and blue lights of police cruisers flashed brightly through the front windows, casting frantic shadows across the living room walls. 4 Atlanta Police Department officers swarmed into the house, their voices echoing even through the muffled audio of my phone. Brad leaped up from the recliner in shock, dropping the crystal glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spilling expensive red wine everywhere like a dark stain. He immediately raised his hands, trying to use his corporate charm, shouting that he was a respected financial consultant and that there had been a misunderstanding. The officers did not care about his tailored suit or his vocabulary. They grabbed him, twisted his arms behind his back, and slammed his face right into the very floor he had demanded I surrender to him. I watched the heavy knee of a police officer press firmly into Brad's back as the cold steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Brad started thrashing and screaming, his face contorted in panic, yelling that I was just a senile old fool who had lost his mind. Jada was standing in the corner, shrieking hysterically and waving her hands, completely powerless to stop the reality checking her husband into the pavement. I quietly locked my phone screen and slid it back into my pocket. A nurse called my name, guiding me into a small examination room. The doctor, a young man with a serious expression, inspected the jagged tear on my cheekbone. He cleaned the wound with harsh antiseptic that burned like fire, but I did not flinch. As he prepared the needle to stitch my face back together, my mind drifted to all the times I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace in my family. I felt the sharp prick of the needle piercing my skin, 1, 2, 3 stitches, and with each pull of the thread, a different memory of Brad's blatant disrespect surfaced. I remembered a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. I had hosted Brad and several of his pretentious venture capital friends at my home. I provided the food, the premium alcohol, and the hospitality. Brad stood in my dining room holding a glass of scotch that my money had paid for and loudly entertained his guests at my expense. He is a good guy, but he just fixes toilets for a living. Brad had sneered, unaware that I was standing just outside the kitchen door. He is strictly blue collar, no financial literacy whatsoever. You have to speak slowly and use small words when discussing investments with him. The entire group had chuckled. I remembered how Brad always made a deliberate point to wipe his hand on a napkin after shaking my hand, acting as if the imaginary grime of 40 years of honest backbreaking labor was somehow contagious. He thought my profession was beneath him. He viewed plumbers as the absolute bottom of the social ladder. What this arrogant fool did not realize was that the plumbing empire I built from the ground up had laid the commercial piping for half the corporate skyscrapers his firm rented space in. I had secured government contracts that generated more revenue in a single month than his entire firm saw in a year, but I never bragged. Evelyn and I believed that wealth should be quiet, that flashiness was a sign of insecurity. Brad mistook my silence for ignorance. He mistook my faded flannel shirts for poverty. 4, 5 stitches. The doctor snipped the medical thread and wiped the area clean. He looked at me with genuine concern and asked if I felt safe returning to my house. I looked at my reflection in the small medical mirror. A thick white bandage covered the side of my face. I smiled grimly at the doctor and told him that my house had never been safer. I walked out through the sliding glass doors of the hospital and into the cool evening air. Before I could even reach my truck in the parking lot, my phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. The caller ID flashed with Jada's name. I let it ring 4 times before finally pressing accept and holding the device to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say hello. Jada was not calling to ask about my face. She was not calling to see if her father needed pain medication or if the doctors had checked me for a concussion. She was screaming in a state of pure, unhinged panic and rage. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "They took Brad away like a common criminal. They shoved him into the back of a police cruiser in front of all the neighbors. He is in a holding cell downtown right now. His firm will completely ruin him if he gets a criminal record. Do you have any idea what you have done to his reputation? You need to call the police precinct this exact second and tell them it was a massive misunderstanding." She was hyperventilating, demanding that I fix the mess her husband had created. "Tell them you tripped Dad. Tell them you fell and hit your head on the edge of the chair. Brad is under immense pressure at work and you provoked him by refusing to give up that bedroom. You are humiliating us over a stupid room. Call the cops and drop the charges immediately or I will never speak to you again." She was attempting to gaslight me, blaming me for the violence inflicted upon my own body, treating my physical safety as an inconvenience to her social standing. I stood perfectly still next to my truck, listening to her frantic, shallow breathing through the speaker. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her chaotic energy. I spoke with absolute chilling clarity. "I did not humiliate you, Jada," I said, my voice dropping to a low, heavy timbre. "Your husband humiliated himself when he decided to assault an old man." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her severely uncomfortable. "And as for your demand about dropping the charges, you really should have married a lawyer instead of a fake financial consultant. If you had, you would know exactly how the legal system works in the state of Georgia. Aggravated assault with a weapon against a senior citizen is a felony offense. The state presses the charges, now not me. I could not drop them even if I wanted to. Brad is going to jail." I ended the call, turned off my phone, and climbed into my truck to head home. I arrived at my quiet suburban home and carefully wiped the remaining dried blood from the hardwood floor. The shattered pieces of the oak chair, the one I had bought with my very first commercial plumbing paycheck, were swept into a neat pile and thrown into the garbage. I went upstairs, washed my face carefully, avoided the fresh stitches, took my prescribed antibiotics, and lay down in the dark. The house was silent again, but I knew it would not last. Men like Brad Hayes do not accept defeat gracefully. They lash out. At exactly 2 a.m, a violent, rhythmic pounding echoed up the staircase. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of a heavy boot repeatedly kicking solid wood. I did not turn on the bedside lamp. I simply reached for my tablet on the nightstand and pulled up the front porch camera feed. Brad was standing under the harsh glare of the motion sensor light. His expensive tailored suit, the one he had been wearing when he assaulted me, was violently wrinkled and stained from hours sitting in a downtown holding cell. His tie was missing. His hair was completely disheveled. Behind him stood Jada, clutching her designer purse, looking exhausted and frantic. I knew bail for a felony assault charge was set incredibly high. Knowing their actual spending habits and their obsession with projecting wealth, Jada had likely maxed out every single credit card she possessed just to secure his temporary release. She had drained her last available resources to pull her abusive husband out of a concrete room. Brad was completely unhinged. He kicked the front door again, the heavy thud vibrating through the walls of my home, and he began screaming my name into the cold night air. "Open this door right now, Leon," he roared, his voice cracking with pure rage and humiliation. "You think you can do this to me? I am a respected financial consultant. I am going to completely ruin you. I am going to take every single thing you own until you are out on the street. You are nothing but a washed-up, uneducated plumber. Open this door and give us our luggage." I sat comfortably in my bed, the soft glow of the tablet illuminating my face, watching his pathetic meltdown in high definition. I did not walk downstairs to confront him. I did not speak through the intercom system to argue. I simply tapped the screen to ensure the commercial-grade security system was actively recording both audio and video directly to a secure cloud server. I watched him throw a temper tantrum like a spoiled child who had finally been denied a toy. Every violent threat he screamed, every heavy kick he delivered to my reinforced front door was perfectly captured. This was the exact evidence of unstable and threatening behavior my lawyer needed to secure a permanent restraining order. I carefully highlighted the timestamps of the footage and forwarded the digital files directly to Richard Thorne. After 20 minutes of useless screaming and pacing, Brad realized the police might be called again by a waking neighbor. He violently grabbed Jada by the arm, dragged her toward their leased luxury SUV, and sped off into the darkness, leaving tire marks on my driveway. I finally closed my eyes and went to sleep, feeling an overwhelming sense of control. The next morning, the comforting smell of freshly brewed black coffee filled my kitchen. I sat at the table, the exact same table where Brad had thrown the chair just hours prior. At 8 o'clock sharp, a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. Richard Thorne walked up to my front door carrying a thick leather briefcase. Richard was a man of absolute precision and ruthless legal strategy. He did not waste time with polite pleasantries. He walked straight into my kitchen, accepted a hot mug of coffee, and immediately slid a heavy, tightly packed manila folder across the table toward me. "I pulled all of his financial records last night through my private investigative contacts," Richard said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. "Your son-in-law is not a venture capital genius, Leon. He is a walking financial disaster." I opened the folder. The very first document was a bright red foreclosure notice. Brad and Jada had been bragging for months about their stunning downtown penthouse, constantly posting photos of their skyline views on social media to impress their fake friends. The truth was laid out right in front of me in stark black and white ink. They had not paid their mortgage in 6 full months. The bank was legally seizing the property by the end of the week. I flipped to the next page, and the reality of their situation grew even darker. It was a formal, terrifying notice from the Internal Revenue Service. Brad had been severely overstating his income, faking investment returns, and hiding money in offshore accounts to avoid federal taxes for years. His firm was completely unaware of his illegal side dealings, but the federal government had finally caught up to him. He owed the IRS over $800,000 in back taxes, severe penalties, and compounding interest. His personal bank accounts were completely frozen by federal mandate. His credit score was annihilated. He had absolutely zero liquid cash to his name. Everything clicked into place with perfect crystal clarity. The sudden demanding desire to move into my home was not out of convenience for a new business project. It was out of absolute panic-stricken desperation. They were about to be thrown out onto the street with nothing but the designer clothes on their backs. Brad had planned to manipulate me, force me down into the damp basement, and gradually take legal control of my property to save himself from total financial ruin. He had looked down on my calloused hands and my faded jeans, entirely unaware that the man he was trying to scam had more money sitting in a single checking account than Brad had ever earned in his entire miserable life. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a naive, uneducated old laborer. He did not realize I owned the board, the pieces, and the table they sat on. Evelyn had warned me about this years ago. Before my beautiful wife passed away, she held my hand and told me that Jada was easily blinded by flashy things and empty promises. "Do not ever let Jada fall into the hands of a con artist," she had whispered. I was looking at the undeniable proof that Brad was exactly that. A desperate, failing con artist trying to use my life's work as a financial lifeboat. And Jada was foolish enough to sink right alongside him. Richard and I were deeply engaged in discussing the legal strategy for freezing Brad out entirely when a sharp, authoritative knock interrupted our conversation. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. It was not Brad or Jada returning for their luggage. It was the local chief of police, a stern man I had known personally for over a decade. I opened the door expecting him to ask for a formal written statement regarding the violent assault from yesterday. Instead, his expression was incredibly grim and profoundly uncomfortable. Leon the chief said, slowly removing his hat and shifting his weight with obvious reluctance, "I need you to step outside for a moment. Jada was at the precinct first thing this morning. She filed a formal sworn report claiming you have severe advanced dementia. She told the magistrate you had an episode of severe paranoia, threw yourself against a chair to deliberately cause that facial injury, and falsely framed her husband because you are losing your mind. She is actively petitioning the state for immediate emergency guardianship over you, your house, and your entire estate." I thanked the chief of police for his transparency, calmly gestured to Richard standing right behind me in the kitchen, and informed the chief that my high-powered corporate attorney was already drafting a comprehensive response to my daughter's absurd allegations. Richard handed the chief a stack of preliminary medical evaluations I had completed just last month for my life insurance renewal, proving my cognitive functions were absolutely flawless. The chief nodded visibly, relieved he did not have to drag an old friend out of his own house, and left. Jada's emergency guardianship petition was dead on arrival. She had fired her strongest weapon, and it had bounced right off my armor. I knew it would only be a matter of time before she changed her tactics. 3 days later, the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera. It was Jada. She was standing on my front porch alone, looking like a completely different person from the screaming, entitled woman who had demanded my bedroom. She wore a simple, understated sweater. Her makeup was entirely washed off, leaving her face looking pale and exhausted. In her hands, she held a large foil-covered glass baking dish. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Jada immediately burst into heavy theatrical tears. She did not yell. She did not make demands. She simply stood there, letting her shoulders shake as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry," she sobbed, her voice trembling with perfect, practiced fragility. "I was so wrong. Brad was completely out of line. I was just so scared and overwhelmed by everything going on with his work that I lost my mind. Please, Dad. Please let me come inside. I cannot stand fighting with you." I stepped back silently, allowing her to cross the threshold into the hallway. She walked straight into the kitchen and set the glass dish on the counter. She pulled back the aluminum foil, and the warm, sweet aroma of baked peaches, cinnamon, and brown sugar instantly filled the room. I looked down at the dessert. It was a peach cobbler. Not a store-bought pastry, but a homemade peach cobbler, baked exactly the way my late wife Evelyn used to make it. Evelyn had spent years perfecting that specific recipe, adding a secret dash of nutmeg and a thick, buttery lattice crust that always turned golden brown. It was the dessert she baked for every single one of my birthdays, every Thanksgiving, and every time I came home exhausted after a grueling month-long commercial plumbing project. Evelyn had taught Jada how to bake it when she was just a little girl standing on a step stool in this very kitchen. Jada was weaponizing her dead mother's memory to manipulate my emotions. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with fresh tears, playing the role of the broken, remorseful daughter to absolute perfection. "I baked this for you this morning, Dad," Jada whispered, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. I was thinking about Mom all night. I was thinking about how disappointed she would be right now seeing us tear each other apart like this. She loved Brad. She loved our family. She always said that no matter how angry we get, we have to find a way to forgive each other. Mom would never want to see her son-in-law sitting in a cold jail cell facing felony charges. She would want us to heal. She reached into her purse and pulled out a neatly folded document, sliding it across the kitchen table toward me. I printed out a formal family reconciliation agreement, she said, her voice softening into a desperate plea. Brad is willing to undergo anger management counseling. He is deeply ashamed of what he did to your face. This paper just formally states that we have reached a private family settlement and that you are officially requesting the district attorney to drop the aggravated assault charges. If you sign this, we can put this entire nightmare behind us. We can be a family again, exactly the way Mom would have wanted. I looked at the paper resting on the kitchen table. I did not reach for my reading glasses in my shirt pocket. Instead, I squinted hard, leaning forward and putting on a masterful performance of a tired, aging father whose vision was rapidly failing him. I let my hands tremble just slightly as I smoothed out the document. My eyesight was actually perfectly fine. I could read the fine print clearly from 2 feet away. I recognized the legal formatting instantly. This was absolutely not a family reconciliation agreement. There was no mention of assault charges or anger management. Boldly printed at the top, disguised under a misleading cover sheet, was a durable financial power of attorney. If my pen touched that signature line, I would be legally granting Jada sweeping, unrestricted authority to access every single one of my bank accounts, liquidate my investment portfolios, and sell this very house out from under me. She had failed to seize my assets through a fake dementia claim, so she was trying to trick me into handing her the keys to the kingdom voluntarily. I looked up at her. She was holding her breath, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. I let out a heavy, defeated sigh. "You are right, Jada," I said, my voice sounding weak and resigned. "Your mother would hate to see us fighting. I just want peace in my house." I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my own pen. It was a sleek black ballpoint pen I had purchased from a novelty magic shop a few years ago to play a prank on one of my plumbing foremen. It was loaded with highly specialized disappearing ink. The ink flowed dark and permanent upon contact with paper, but its chemical composition caused it to completely evaporate and vanish without a trace within 2 hours of exposure to the air. I clicked the pen, pressed the tip to the signature line, and confidently signed my full legal name, Leon Crawford, across the bottom of the fraudulent power of attorney document. The exact second the ink finished forming the last letter of my name, the entire atmosphere in the kitchen shifted. Jada did not thank me. She did not hug me or offer me a slice of the peach cobbler she had baked using her dead mother's recipe. Her fake tears vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, triumphant smirk. She snatched the document off the table so fast, she nearly tore the paper, quickly folding it and shoving it deep into her designer purse. Without saying another word, she turned on her heel and marched straight out the front door. I stood perfectly still by the kitchen window, watching her practically sprint down the driveway toward her luxury SUV. Before she even opened her car door, she pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number. I could see the massive, greedy grin plastered across her face as she pressed the phone to her ear, undoubtedly calling Brad to boast that she had successfully conned the old man out of his entire fortune. I watched her speed away down the street, smiling to myself, fully aware that by the time she proudly slammed that document onto a bank manager's desk, my signature would be completely gone. I did not have to be inside the marble lobby of the downtown First National Bank to know exactly how the scene was unfolding. My lawyer Richard had already placed a direct call to the branch manager earlier that morning, giving him a strict warning about a potential fraud attempt regarding my accounts. Jada and Brad strutted through the heavy glass doors of the bank as if they owned the entire building. Brad was currently out on bail, sweating profusely through a fresh designer dress shirt, his arrogant swagger completely masking the desperate, sinking reality of his financial ruin. Jada marched right up to the premier banking desk, skipping the regular teller line entirely. She demanded an immediate audience with the branch manager. When they were escorted into the private, glass-walled office, Brad did not even bother to sit down. He aggressively slapped the fraudulent power of attorney document flat onto the polished mahogany desk. "We need a cashier's check for $200,000 drafted immediately," Brad demanded, tapping his expensive watch to emphasize his fake importance. "My father-in-law has officially granted us full financial control of his estate due to his rapidly declining mental health. We are moving his liquid assets into a secure management fund." Just process the withdrawal right now. We do not have all day to wait around. Jada stood next to him, nodding emphatically, her eyes practically glowing with the greedy anticipation of stealing my hard-earned savings to rescue her abusive husband from his massive IRS debts. They thought they had executed the perfect crime. They thought the man sitting behind the desk was just another corporate drone who would blindly obey their wealthy facade without asking any difficult questions. They were entirely wrong. The branch manager sitting across from them was a sharply dressed, highly intelligent African-American man named Derek. What Jada and Brad did not know, and what they had never bothered to ask about my personal life, was the deep history I shared with the man currently evaluating their forged paperwork. 15 years ago, long before Derek wore tailored suits and managed multi-million-dollar portfolios, he was a struggling 19-year-old kid working the night shift at a local hardware store where I regularly bought my commercial plumbing supplies. I used to come in covered in dirt and pipe grease, and Derek was always there reading heavy economics textbooks behind the cash register to keep himself awake. One evening, I found him sitting on a stack of drywall in the back aisle crying. His single mother had just lost her job, and Derek was forced to drop out of university because they could not afford his tuition for the upcoming semester. He was going to abandon his degree to work full-time for minimum wage. I did not offer him pity. The next morning, I walked into that hardware store and handed Derek a certified business check from my plumbing corporation that covered his entire tuition, his books, and his housing for the next 3 years. When he tried to refuse, crying and promising to pay me back with interest, I simply told him to graduate, get a powerful job, and make sure nobody ever took advantage of hardworking people. Derek never forgot that moment. He rose through the ranks of the competitive financial world and eventually became the manager of the exact branch where my primary trusts were securely held. He knew exactly who I was. He knew the immense, staggering weight of my actual financial portfolio. And he possessed a fierce, unwavering loyalty to the old plumber who had changed the trajectory of his entire life. Derek looked at Brad with a calm, unboding expression. He did not flinch at Brad's aggressive tone or Jada's impatient sighs. He simply reached out, adjusted his glasses, and pulled the power of attorney document toward him. "I understand you are in a rush, sir," Derek said, his voice smooth and incredibly professional. "However, to authorize a massive withdrawal of $200,000 from Mr. Crawford's primary savings account, I must formally verify the signature and the notary stamp on this legal document." Derek deliberately took his time. He smoothed out the paper. He examined the header. He let the thick silence in the room stretch for a full, agonizing minute. The 2-hour window for my trick pen had officially expired while Jada was sitting in heavy Atlanta traffic. The chemical composition of the ink had reacted with the oxygen in the air, completely evaporating from the fibers of the paper without leaving a single trace. Derek looked down at the bottom of the page, then looked back up at Brad and Jada with an expression of absolute chilling professional confusion. "I apologize, Mr. Hayes," Derek said, turning the document around and sliding it back across the mahogany desk. "But I cannot process this withdrawal under any circumstances. This document is completely invalid." Brad slammed his fist on the desk, his face turning a furious shade of crimson. "What are you talking about? It is a standard power of attorney. Process the money right now before I call your corporate office." Derek simply pointed a calm finger to the bottom line of the paper. "You cannot execute a power of attorney without a signature, sir. This signature line is completely blank." Jada let out a confused gasp and leaned over the desk. She stared at the crisp, empty white space where she had personally watched me sign my name just hours earlier. There was no ink. There was no indentation. There was absolutely nothing. "It is impossible!" Jada shrieked frantically, flipping the paper over as if the signature had somehow magically slid to the back. He signed it. I stood right there and watched him sign it in his kitchen. Brad violently grabbed the paper from her hands, his eyes widening in sheer panic as he realized the document was entirely worthless. "You wiped it!" Brad roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at Derek. "You used some kind of chemical on your desk. You are trying to protect that senile old man. Give me the money or I will have your job by the end of the day." Derek's demeanor instantly shifted from polite customer service to absolute glacial authority. He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his leather chair and reached his hand underneath his desk. "Attempting to execute a fraudulent, unsigned legal document to seize the financial assets of a senior citizen is a severe federal offense," Mr. Hayes Derek stated clearly, his eyes locking onto Brad's panicked face. "And threatening a bank officer while attempting to commit wire fraud is a felony." Derek pressed his finger firmly against the silent panic button hidden beneath his desk. Instantly, the heavy magnetic security locks on the bank's main glass doors engaged with a loud, echoing click. The digital displays above the teller stations flashed a bright warning red. Two armed security guards immediately stepped away from the perimeter walls and positioned themselves directly in front of the glass doors of Derek's office, blocking any chance of escape. Brad and Jada spun around, realizing they were completely trapped inside a federal building with fake documents. Brad was already out on bail for a felony assault charge, and now he was caught red-handed attempting to rob a bank. The trap had flawlessly snapped shut. Despite being detained at the bank, Brad and Jada managed to secure a temporary release by weaponizing their remaining high-priced defense attorneys, exploiting legal loopholes to walk free while the federal indictment was formally prepared. However, Brad was now a desperate animal backed completely into a corner. The frozen assets and looming IRS foreclosure meant his borrowed time was evaporating by the hour. Since his attempt to forge my signature failed spectacularly, he needed a way to legally override my autonomy entirely. He needed the state to declare me mentally incompetent. Just 2 days after the bank incident, a sleek silver car pulled into my driveway. A tall, overly groomed man stepped out wearing a sharply tailored gray suit that screamed of misplaced arrogance. I recognized him immediately from the dossier Richard had compiled on Brad's associates. This was Dr. Aris, a disgraced psychiatrist, to my porch and rang the bell with aggressive authority. When I opened the door, he did not introduce himself politely. He pushed his way past me, waving a clipboard with a fake city seal printed on the top. "Mr. Crawford, I am here to conduct a state-mandated cognitive wellness check, doctor." Aris declared, his tone dripping with fake bureaucratic authority. "Your family has raised severe concerns regarding your ability to care for yourself. I am legally required to assess your mental state today. If you refuse, I will call the authorities and have you removed from this property for an involuntary psychiatric hold." I looked past his shoulder through the open doorway and saw Brad's luxury SUV parked down the street, idling in the shadows. Brad was waiting for the golden ticket. I did not argue or attempt to block the doorway. I simply stepped aside, offering a weak, trembling nod, and led the corrupt doctor into my kitchen. Dr. Aris sat at my kitchen table, unpacking his forms with the theatrical precision of a man who loved the sound of his own voice. He looked around my modest home, his eyes lingering on my worn work boots by the door and the faded flannel jacket draped over a chair. I could see the absolute contempt radiating from his posture. He looked at me the exact same way Brad did, seeing nothing but a dirty, uneducated laborer who had outlived his usefulness. Men like Dr. Aris possessed framed degrees from prestigious universities but lacked a single ounce of genuine intelligence or moral fiber. During my 40 years running a massive commercial plumbing corporation, I had dealt with hundreds of men exactly like him. They were the architects and developers who would look down their noses at my crew, spouting theoretical jargon, only to call me in a blind panic when their multi-million-dollar luxury high-rises were flooding with raw sewage because they tried to cut corners on the pipe fittings. I knew exactly how to dismantle a man whose entire ego was built on a piece of paper. "You have spent your whole life working with your hands," Mr. Crawford, Aris said, leaning forward and speaking to me at a slow, insulting pace as if I were a toddler. "Manual labor takes a heavy toll on the brain. The constant exposure to toxic chemicals, the physical exhaustion, the distinct lack of higher intellectual stimulation. It is perfectly normal for a man of your distinctly blue-collar background to experience rapid cognitive decay in his later years. We are just here to make sure you do not hurt yourself or mismanage the little savings you have left." He was laying the groundwork for his fraudulent medical report, establishing a narrative that my years of hard, honest work had somehow rotted my mind. He was completely unaware that the blue-collar laborer sitting across from him possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of complex federal tax codes, corporate trust structures, and commercial contract law. He thought he was walking into an easy payday, an effortless scam orchestrated by his wealthy client Brad. He had no idea he had just stepped onto a financial and legal landmine. I slumped my shoulders, letting my posture project the image of a defeated, frail old man. I folded my hands in my lap. What Dr. Aris could not see was that directly underneath the lip of the kitchen table, securely fastened with industrial mounting tape, was a high-fidelity digital audio recorder. I had installed it the previous night, anticipating that Brad would send someone directly to my home. With a subtle flick of my thumb, I pressed the record button. A tiny, invisible red light indicated the device was actively capturing every single sound in the room. "Let us begin with some basic questions," Eris said, clicking his pen. "Can you tell me what year it is, Mr. Crawford?" I stared blankly at the wall for a long moment, furrowing my brow. "It is 1998, I whispered, intentionally citing the year my late wife Evelyn and I bought this house. Aris smirked quickly, scribbling a note on his clipboard. "And who is the current president of the United States?" he asked next. I gave him the name of a politician who had been out of office for over a decade. I played the role perfectly. When he asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, I stopped at 85, rubbed my temples, and muttered that my head was hurting too much to think about numbers. The doctor's smug satisfaction was palpable. He leaned back in his chair, completely dropping his professional facade. "Brad was absolutely right," Eris chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You are completely gone, old man. You do not even know what decade you are living in. This is going to be the easiest $10,000 I have ever made in my career." I kept my eyes fixed on the table, maintaining my vacant expression while my heart surged with quiet victory. The greedy fool had just confessed to accepting a $10,000 cash bribe from my son-in-law to falsify a medical document, and he had said it loudly and clearly directly into my hidden microphone. Dr. Eris aggressively checked the final box on his evaluation form and snapped his clipboard shut. "Well, Mr. Crawford, the assessment is complete," he announced, standing up and smoothing his expensive tie. "I will be filing this report with the state health department immediately. You will be transferred to a specialized care facility very soon for your own safety." He turned his back on me and walked out the front door, immediately pulling out his cell phone to call Brad with the good news. The second the heavy oak door clicked shut, my vacant, confused expression vanished completely. I sat up perfectly straight, my mind razor sharp. I reached under the table, retrieved the digital recorder, and stopped the capture. I plugged the device into my laptop, attached the crystal-clear audio file to an encrypted email, and sent it directly to Richard Thorne. My message was short and absolute. Add medical fraud and witness bribery to Brad's federal indictment. The doctor just handed us the nail for his coffin. Less than an hour after I forwarded the audio file of the corrupt psychiatrist to my attorney, my phone rang. It was Richard Thorne. His voice, usually a mask of calm, calculated legal detachment, held a rare edge of genuine urgency. The audio recording of the doctor confessing to the bribe was brilliant, Richard stated, but it was no longer the most pressing issue on our hands. While Dr. Eris was sitting in my kitchen trying to fabricate a dementia diagnosis, Richard had deployed a highly specialized forensic accountant to deeply probe the financial infrastructure of Brad's business dealings. What they uncovered went far beyond simple unpaid mortgages or bloated credit card debt. Brad was in a state of absolute frantic panic. Knowing that the Internal Revenue Service was slowly tightening the noose around his domestic accounts, he was taking extreme illegal measures to salvage his stolen wealth. He was currently attempting to funnel his remaining liquid assets out of the United States. The forensic accountant had intercepted a series of highly sophisticated encrypted wire transfers, routing hundreds of thousands of dollars into newly established shell corporations located in the Cayman Islands. He was trying to hide the money from federal seizure, hoping to build a secret nest egg to fall back on when his domestic life inevitably imploded. But Brad was a coward. He knew the monumental risk of executing these illegal international transfers, so he did not just put his own name on the offshore accounts. He had forged Jada's digital signature and explicitly listed her as the primary co-owner of the shell companies. He was using my own daughter as a human shield. If the federal government tracked the missing funds, Jada would be held equally liable for international tax evasion, wire fraud, and massive money laundering. She would face decades in a federal penitentiary right alongside him. He was fully prepared to sacrifice his own wife, the woman he swore to protect, just to save his stolen cash. Staring at the damning financial documents Richard had securely transmitted to my tablet, a profound, heavy silence settled over my quiet kitchen. My mind drifted back 5 years to a sterile, quiet hospital room bathed in the soft, fading light of a late autumn afternoon. My beautiful wife Evelyn was lying in the medical bed, her body severely weakened by a brutal fight against a relentless illness. But her mind was as sharp and fiercely protective as the day I first met her. She held my calloused, scarred hands tightly in her frail ones. Evelyn had always possessed an incredible ability to see right through people. While Jada was completely mesmerized by Brad's tailored suits, His leased luxury vehicles, and his smooth, practiced corporate vocabulary, Evelyn saw the hollow, greedy void lurking behind his charming smile. She knew Brad was not a provider. She knew he was a parasite. On her very last day, her breathing shallow but her grip incredibly firm, Evelyn pulled me close. "Do not ever let Jada fall into the hands of a con artist," she had whispered to me, her voice rough but absolute. "She is blinded by the shine of fake gold Leon. Protect her even if you have to completely break her heart to do it. Do whatever it takes to save our little girl from a man who only loves himself." I had made a solemn, unbreakable vow to my dying wife that afternoon. Looking at the undeniable proof of Brad intentionally tying Jada to a massive federal crime, I knew exactly what fulfilling that vow truly required. Protecting my daughter did not mean bailing her out with my hidden wealth or shielding her from the harsh consequences of her foolish marriage. It meant utterly destroying the parasite she had attached herself to. It meant tearing down Brad's entire fraudulent empire brick by brick so he could never use her or anyone else ever again. I had to execute Evelyn's final wish in the most ruthless surgical way possible. I had to let the fire burn the dead wood away so a completely new foundation could be built. I did not wait for the morning light. I did not leave this entirely in the hands of my legal team to negotiate slowly in a civil courtroom. I walked straight into my home office, booted up my heavily encrypted desktop computer, and accessed the official online portal for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The federal government has a highly structured whistleblower program specifically designed to reward and protect individuals who provide actionable, concrete evidence of massive tax fraud and financial crimes. I was not interested in the financial reward. I was only interested in the absolute devastating power of a federal hammer dropping squarely onto Brad's life. I methodically created a comprehensive digital dossier. I uploaded every single piece of evidence Richard's forensic accountant had uncovered. I attached the specific routing numbers for the Cayman Islands shell companies. I attached the time-stamped logs of the illegal wire transfers. I included the falsified tax returns Brad had filed over the last 4 years alongside the forged corporate documents where he had illegally tied my daughter to his international financial crimes. I made sure to explicitly highlight the digital footprint, proving Jada was completely unaware of the offshore accounts, isolating Brad as the sole mastermind of the fraud to ensure my daughter would not be dragged away in handcuffs by federal agents. I reviewed the submitted package one final time, ensuring every document was perfectly legible, categorized, and undeniably damning. The glow of the monitor reflected in my eyes as I hovered the mouse over the screen. With a steady, calloused finger, I pressed the submit button. The encrypted package vanished into the federal database. There was no undoing this. Brad's financial death warrant had been officially signed, sealed, and delivered to the most relentless collection agency on the planet. The very next morning, the polished, high-pressure environment of Brad's prestigious downtown venture capital firm was abruptly and violently shattered. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass elevator doors slid open on the 40th floor. A team of 6 stern-faced individuals stepped out wearing dark windbreakers with the letters IRS, Criminal Investigation, printed in bold yellow text across their backs. They did not stop at the front receptionist's desk to ask for permission. They bypassed the security gate, entirely carrying empty cardboard boxes and a thick stack of federal warrants. They marched straight down the quiet glass hallway, walking past dozens of shocked and whispering corporate executives, and kicked open the heavy oak door to Brad's corner office. Brad was sitting in his expensive leather chair, sipping a latte and reviewing a spreadsheet. The smug, arrogant smirk was instantly wiped from his face as the armed federal agents swarmed his personal workspace. They slammed a comprehensive zero-tolerance asset freeze and seizure order onto his pristine glass desk, demanding he step away from his computer immediately and keep his hands exactly where they could see them. I was a drowning man, and drowning men will grasp at anything to stay afloat. Less than 48 hours after the federal agents marched into his office and froze his entire existence, my phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was a video file sent directly from Brad. I opened it and watched a heavily manipulated, maliciously spliced piece of security footage from my own living room. It was from the day he threw the oak chair. However, the footage had been aggressively edited. The frames where Brad hurled the chair were completely cut out. Instead, the video abruptly skipped and looped to show a brief moment where I had raised my arm in self-defense, followed by a cut of Jada tripping over one of her own designer suitcases. Without the original context, the edited video made it look exactly as if I had violently shoved my own daughter to the hardwood floor in a fit of unprovoked rage. A second later, Brad called me. I answered, and his voice came through the speaker, frantic, manic, and dripping with cornered desperation. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," Brad hissed, his breath ragged. "I am sending this video to the local news stations, to your neighbors, and to the police department in exactly 2 hours. I will tell them you attacked your own daughter. I will have you arrested for domestic violence. Your entire reputation in this community will be completely annihilated. You will rot in a prison cell." I listened to his frantic breathing, keeping my own breathing perfectly steady. "What do you want, Brad?" I asked, intentionally making my voice sound thin and frightened. "I want the house," he demanded instantly. "My lawyer has drawn up a quitclaim deed. You are going to sign over the entire property to Jada and me right now. No trusts, no conditions, just a direct transfer of the deed. You meet me at my lawyer's office in 30 minutes and sign the house over, or I hit send and your life is over." He texted me an address for a flashy, low-rent law office located in a commercial strip mall. It was the exact kind of place a desperate man goes when the high-powered corporate firms refuse to return his phone calls. I drove my truck across town, mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. When I walked into the cramped, poorly lit conference room, Brad was already sitting at the table. He looked absolutely terrible. He was wearing the same wrinkled suit from the day of his arrest. The dark circles under his eyes revealed he had not slept since the federal agents raided his firm. Yet despite his catastrophic reality, he still wore that identical, sickeningly arrogant smirk. He honestly believed he had just checkmated me. "You finally realized who you are dealing with," Brad sneered as I took a seat across from him. His sleazy defense attorney slid a thick stack of legal documents across the cheap veneer table. Brad leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, eager to twist the knife. He needed to humiliate me to make himself feel powerful again. "You spent 40 years of your life crawling in human waste, Leon," Brad said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You ruined your knees and scarred your hands doing a job that a high school dropout could do. You saved your pennies for decades to pay off this pathetic suburban house. And now, because you are a weak, uneducated laborer who does not understand how the real world operates, you are going to hand your biggest asset over to me in 5 minutes. I sat perfectly still, letting his insults wash over me like water off a stone. I did not defend my career. I did not mention the multi-million-dollar commercial contracts I had executed or the massive high-rises my company had plumbed. I let his massive, fragile ego inflate to the point of bursting. Men like me always win. Brad continued laughing, a dry, bitter laugh. "We use our brains. We do not use our hands. You are just a dirty old plumber, and I am the one walking away with an $800,000 property. Sign the paper, Leon. Sign it right now, or I swear to God I will post that video and watch the police drag you out of your house in handcuffs." I knew the video was a pathetic bluff. Richard had already secured the original unedited time-stamped security footage in a secure cloud server. I could have easily dismantled Brad's threat with a single phone call to the district attorney. But dismantling his threat would mean keeping my house, and right now giving Brad exactly what he wanted was the most lethal weapon I possessed. I needed him to take ownership of this specific property, so I played the role of the defeated, terrified father. I slumped my shoulders forward, letting my posture collapse. I kept my eyes averted, staring down at the table as if I were utterly broken. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy black pen the lawyer had provided. I let my hand tremble violently. I brought the pen to the paper, hovering over the signature line, and looked up at Brad with wide, fearful eyes. "If I sign this," I whispered, my voice shaking perfectly, "you have to promise to delete that video. You cannot show that to anyone. You have to promise to leave me alone." Brad snatched the pen from my hand, shoved it back into my palm, and pointed aggressively at the dotted line. "I promise nothing until you sign," he barked. "Sign the deed, old man. Give me my house." With a heavy manufactured sigh of total defeat, I pressed the pen to the paper. I did not use disappearing ink this time. I used permanent, legally binding ink. I signed my full name, authorizing the absolute transfer of my $800,000 suburban home directly into Brad and Jada's names. The lawyer quickly snatched the document, stamped it with his notary seal, and declared the transfer legally binding. Brad's face erupted into a massive, victorious grin. He practically vibrated with excitement. In his desperate, panic-stricken mind, he had just secured a massive, unencumbered asset that he could leverage or sell to pay off the IRS and save himself from federal prison. He had no idea he had just swallowed a lethal financial poison pill. I stood up slowly, playing the part of a ruined man to the very end, and walked out of the conference room. Brad followed me out into the bright afternoon sun of the parking lot. As I reached the door of my truck, Brad called out to me. I turned around to see him laughing loudly, completely drunk on his fake victory. "What a pathetic, miserable old man," Brad shouted, not caring who heard him in the parking lot. "Have fun rotting in a cheap apartment, loser." I did not get angry. I did not yell back. I simply looked at him standing there in his ruined suit and allowed a small, cold, highly mysterious smile to spread across my face. I turned around, got into my truck, and drove away, leaving him to celebrate a victory that would completely destroy him. I drove my truck back to the quiet suburban street that had been my home for decades. I knew my time in that house was officially over, but I needed to collect a few personal items. However, Brad did not waste a single second. By the time I pulled my truck into the driveway, another vehicle was already parked on the front lawn. It was a commercial locksmith van. I walked up the concrete path and saw a man in a work uniform actively drilling out the heavy brass deadbolts on my front door. Jada was standing on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching me approach with a cold, unapologetic glare. Brad strutted out from the living room, waving the freshly notarized quitclaim deed in the air like a golden ticket. He had a triumphant, manic energy radiating from his pores. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a single suitcase and get off my property," Brad announced, his voice carrying down the street for any nosy neighbors to hear. "The locksmith is finishing up the new deadbolts right now. You do not own this space anymore, Leon. It belongs to us." I looked at Jada, giving her one final opportunity to show a shred of empathy or remorse for throwing her elderly father out onto the street. She did not flinch. "You brought this on yourself, Dad," she said, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. "If you had just given up the bedroom when we asked nicely, we would not have to do this the hard way. Go pack your things. We have decorators coming tomorrow to measure the space." I did not argue. I did not beg for more time or plead for a place to sleep. I simply walked past them, my heavy work boots thudding against the hardwood floor for the last time. I went into my bedroom and pulled a small vintage leather suitcase from the top of the closet. I did not pack clothes or toiletries. I only packed the things that actually mattered. I packed Evelyn's framed photographs, the small wooden jewelry box she kept on her nightstand, and the original set of heavy iron pipe wrenches I had used to build my very first commercial contract. Everything else in the house was just meaningless material. I snapped the suitcase shut and walked back down the stairs. Brad was waiting at the bottom, tapping his foot impatiently. He physically snatched the suitcase from my hand, shoved it out the open front door onto the concrete walkway, and pointed toward the street. "Have fun at the homeless shelter, old man," Brad laughed, his voice dripping with pure malice. The locksmith slammed the new heavy door shut right in my face, and I heard the distinct heavy click of the new locks sliding into place. As I stood alone on the sidewalk, looking at the closed front door, I thought about what Brad had actually just taken ownership of. He was completely blinded by his own greed and his desperate, panicked need to secure an asset to sell to the Internal Revenue Service. He saw an $800,000 house and demanded it. What he failed to do was execute a basic fundamental title search. If he had hired a competent corporate attorney instead of a cheap strip mall lawyer, he would have discovered the monumental secret buried in the zoning history of the property. 3 years ago, after Evelyn passed away, my attorney Richard Thorne and I engaged in a massive restructuring of my entire financial empire. We moved my commercial wealth into a series of highly insulated, impenetrable blind trusts. But this specific suburban house was handled entirely differently. Because of the massive industrial scale of my commercial plumbing and waste management contracts across the state, I required a legally registered secondary transit site for specialized materials. Working alongside Richard and federal regulators, I formally rezoned this specific residential address and its heavily reinforced concrete basement into a registered commercial holding site. I legally attached the property to my commercial waste processing corporation. The house was not just a house, it was a highly regulated corporate liability. Anyone who accepted a direct, unshielded transfer of this specific deed outside of my corporate trust umbrella did not just acquire the equity of the real estate, they legally assumed total unfiltered personal responsibility for the commercial environmental status of the property. By forcing me to sign that quitclaim deed directly into his personal name, Brad had completely bypassed my corporate liability shields. He had eagerly swallowed a lethal financial poison pill, totally unaware that the medicine he thought would cure his IRS debt was actually going to completely destroy him. I heard the muffled sound of a champagne cork popping from inside the living room. Brad and Jada were celebrating. They assumed I would be walking to a bus stop or calling a cheap taxi to carry me to a rundown motel. They assumed I was broken. A few moments later, a sleek custom black luxury SUV with heavily tinted windows and flawless chrome detailing glided silently to the curb right in front of the house. The driver, a professional private chauffeur hired directly by Richard Thorne, stepped out wearing a crisp black suit and white gloves. He did not say a word. He simply walked over to my vintage leather suitcase, picked it up with utmost respect, and placed it gently into the carpeted trunk. He then opened the rear passenger door for me. I stepped into the plush, immaculate leather interior of the luxury vehicle. The climate control was perfectly set. There was a cold bottle of premium sparkling water waiting for me in the center console. I settled into the seat and looked out through the tinted glass at the house I had occupied for decades. I felt absolutely no sadness. I felt no regret. I only felt the cold, deeply satisfying anticipation of absolute justice. The chauffeur closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the suburban street, and the SUV pulled away smoothly. We were not heading to a shelter. We were driving toward my actual primary residence, a stunning multi-million-dollar gated lakefront estate that Jada and Brad had absolutely no idea existed. I left them behind to dance and celebrate inside their hollow toxic victory. Inside the house, Brad was completely drunk on his fake triumph. He poured himself another glass of champagne and decided to explore his newly conquered domain. He was eager to find the old heavy floor safe he knew I kept hidden down in the basement. He desperately wanted to see if the stupid old plumber had left any loose cash or valuable family heirlooms behind. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer, opened the basement door, and walked down the creaking wooden steps into the damp, echoing space. He swept the bright beam of light across the cold concrete floor, searching for the metal safe. Instead, the blinding light caught something massive stacked securely in the far corner. Brad froze in his tracks. Neatly arranged against the reinforced concrete wall were 12 heavy-duty industrial-grade steel drums. Each drum was tightly sealed with thick metal clamps. Slapped across the center of every single drum was a massive, bright red commercial warning label indicating highly regulated, toxic chemical waste. Brad stared at the glowing red labels, his arrogant smile completely melting off his face as a sudden icy dread violently gripped his stomach. Brad stood paralyzed in the damp basement, the beam of his heavy flashlight shaking violently as it illuminated the bright red warning labels. He had absolutely no idea what specific chemicals were housed inside those sealed industrial steel drums, but his corporate survival instincts screamed that he was looking at a massive, catastrophic liability. Before he could even step closer to inspect the federal identification numbers printed on the metal, a loud, amplified voice echoed from the street outside, piercing right through the floorboards above his head. It was not the local police this time. It was a federal bullhorn. Brad dropped the flashlight, sprinted up the wooden stairs, his heart hammering aggressively against his ribs, and burst through the front door with Jada right behind him. The quiet suburban street had been completely overtaken. 3 large white commercial vans and 2 black government SUVs were parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn and driveway. Men and women wearing bright yellow hazmat vests with the letters EPA emblazoned across the back were already rolling out thick yellow caution tape, efficiently cordoning off the entire perimeter of the property. The Environmental Protection Agency had arrived in full force. A stern woman with a thick metal clipboard and a federal badge hanging from her neck marched straight up the concrete walkway. "Are you Bradley Hayes?" she demanded, her voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or corporate charm. Brad swallowed hard, nodding weakly as he desperately tried to adjust his wrinkled, sweat-stained suit jacket. The woman signaled to 2 armed agents who immediately stepped onto the porch. We received an automated regulatory notification from the county clerk that the commercial deed for this registered hazardous transit site was transferred directly into your personal name yesterday afternoon, the federal agent stated firmly. "Step off the porch immediately. This site requires a mandatory commercial compliance inspection for the transfer of regulated toxic materials." Jada looked at Brad in absolute terror, tightly clutching his arm. Brad tried to put on his best consultant smile, raising his hands defensively as if he were negotiating a bad boardroom deal. "There must be a huge mistake, officer," he stammered, sweating profusely under the morning sun. "This is just a residential home. We just took ownership from my father-in-law. He is an old retired plumber. There is nothing commercial here." The EPA agent did not smile back. She simply pointed a rigid finger toward the street and ordered them to stand behind the yellow barricade tape. As Brad and Jada stood shivering on the sidewalk behind the bright yellow plastic tape, they watched a specialized team of federal inspectors march straight into the house and head directly for the basement door. What Brad completely failed to comprehend was the actual staggering scale of my life's work. When you run an 8-figure commercial plumbing corporation that services 50-story corporate skyscrapers, massive sports arenas, and federal hospital wings, you do not just use standard drain cleaner from the local grocery store. You use highly potent, heavily regulated industrial solvents and enzymatic acids to dissolve metric tons of concrete like buildup biological waste and calcified grease deep within city infrastructure. Those specific chemicals require specialized handling, strict transportation manifests, and heavily monitored storage facilities. Decades ago, when my company expanded across the entire state of Georgia, I needed a centralized, highly secure location to temporarily stage these industrial materials before they were legally shipped to specialized commercial disposal plants. Working alongside my attorney Richard Thorne and utilizing a perfectly legal municipal zoning loophole, I had successfully transformed the reinforced concrete basement of my suburban home into a federally registered hazardous material transit station. It was fully permitted, intensely regulated, and tied directly to my corporate entity. As long as the property remained shielded under my corporate trust umbrella, the massive environmental taxes, liability insurance, and hazardous handling fees were seamlessly absorbed by my company's multi-million-dollar operating budget. But Brad did not know any of this. He was too busy looking down at my calloused hands and faded work shirts to ever bother looking up my corporate filings. When he maliciously forced me to sign that quitclaim deed, transferring the property entirely out of my insulated corporate trust and directly into his personal name, he triggered an automatic federal audit. The EPA system flagged the highly illegal transfer of a registered hazardous site to an unlicensed, unbonded private citizen. Brad did not just steal a suburban house. He legally adopted an active, highly toxic commercial waste facility without possessing a single license permit or corporate insurance policy to maintain it. He had walked right into the devastating financial bear trap I had left wide open for him. 20 agonizing minutes later, the lead EPA agent emerged from the house, her expression significantly darker than before. She walked straight up to the yellow tape where Brad and Jada were nervously waiting, surrounded by whispering neighbors who had come out to watch the spectacle. She pulled a thick stack of heavily stamped federal documents from her clipboard and shoved them directly into Brad's chest. "You have 12 drums of Class 4 industrial solvents improperly stored for a residential private citizen," the agent declared loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd of neighborhood onlookers could hear every single damning word. "Because you eagerly took direct personal ownership of this regulated site without securing the mandatory federal transfer permits or commercial insurance, you are now in severe violation of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act." Brad frantically flipped through the dense legal documents, his eyes darting across the pages in sheer panic. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. "What does this mean?" Jada shrieked, looking at the papers trembling violently in her husband's hands. "It means your husband is now personally and entirely liable for the immediate commercial extraction, specialized hazmat transport, and federal disposal of the hazardous materials currently sitting in your basement," the agent replied coldly. Brad's knees practically buckled as he reached the final page of the citation. Boldly printed at the bottom, directly above his newly registered status as the sole property owner, was the total mandated environmental penalty and commercial disposal fee. It was not a small administrative fine. It was a legally binding federal invoice for $1,200,000, payable within 30 days. If you fail to remit the payment in full, the agent continued relentlessly, "The federal government will place a hard, inescapable lien on this property, and you will face immediate criminal prosecution for illegal hazardous waste mismanagement." Brad could barely breathe. He was already out on bail for a violent felony assault charge. He was already $800,000 in debt to the Internal Revenue Service with frozen bank accounts. And now, entirely thanks to his own aggressive greed and profound arrogance, he owed the Environmental Protection Agency over $1 million. He was financially annihilated. Brad ripped his cell phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking violently as he dialed my number. I was sitting comfortably on the expansive sun-drenched cedar deck of my multi-million-dollar lakefront estate, a steaming mug of premium dark roast coffee resting in my hand. The surface of the private lake was perfectly still, reflecting the bright morning sky like a sheet of flawless glass. The air was crisp, clean, and completely free of suburban noise. I tapped the screen to answer the call, putting him on speakerphone and placing the device on the patio table. "Leon, you set me up!" Brad screamed into the phone, his voice completely unhinged and breaking with absolute despair. "You gave me a toxic waste dump. You owe the federal government $1 million. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my coffee, listening to the soothing sounds of the water lapping gently against my private wooden dock. "I do not owe the government a single dime." "Brad," I replied, my voice smooth, calm, and utterly merciless. "You are a highly educated white-collar financial consultant. You really should have read the fine print before you stole an old plumber's house. Have a wonderful morning." The phone line crackled with a guttural, animalistic scream. Brad was not just angry. He was experiencing a complete and total psychological collapse. "You cannot do this to me," he bellowed, his voice echoing harshly through the speakerphone and disturbing the peaceful morning air over my private lake. "I will sue you for everything you have. I will take this to the highest court in the state. This is textbook fraud, Leon. You deliberately trapped me with a toxic property." I listened to his frantic, hyperventilating gasps, picturing him standing behind that yellow caution tape while federal agents swarmed the lawn. "Cancel the deed," Brad demanded, his tone violently shifting from blistering rage to a pathetic, wavering desperation. "Call your sleazy lawyer right now and tear up that contract. We will transfer the property back into your name today. I will sign whatever you want. I do not want this house. I do not want this federal liability. You have to take it back." He was practically hyperventilating the crushing reality of a $1.2 million federal invoice, completely destroying his remaining sanity. Through the receiver, I could clearly hear the heavy boots of the environmental protection agents marching across the porch. I could hear Jada in the background sobbing uncontrollably, begging one of the federal officers to explain what was going to happen to her credit score. Brad completely ignored his weeping wife, focusing all his manic energy on trying to bully me one last time. "Listen to me, Leon," Brad pleaded, his voice cracking. "I will delete that security video. I will go down to the police precinct right now and officially recant my statement. I will tell them I lied about the assault. I will drop every single charge against you. I will even let you move back into the master bedroom. Just undo the paperwork immediately. If you do not reverse this transfer, I swear to God I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life behind bars for environmental terrorism. Undo it right now." I leaned back in my comfortable cedar chair, the warm morning sun reflecting off the pristine surface of the lake, and allowed the sheer poetic irony of the situation to wash completely over me. For years, Brad had made it his personal mission to belittle my life's work. At family dinners, holiday gatherings, and casual weekend visits, he never missed a single opportunity to maliciously mock the commercial plumbing profession. To him, I was just an uneducated laborer who unclogged toilets and tightened leaky pipes for a meager wage. He viewed himself as a modern master of the universe simply because he wore Italian suits and moved imaginary numbers around on a computer screen in a sterile, air-conditioned high-rise. He completely failed to understand that the physical infrastructure of this entire country is built, maintained, and operated by men with calloused hands and heavy steel boots. Commercial plumbing is not just water and wrenches. It is navigating highly complex municipal grids. It is managing highly corrosive, toxic chemical solvents, industrial enzymatic degreasers, and biological waste capable of dissolving raw concrete. It requires dealing with stringent federal regulations, environmental impact reports, and massive logistical transportation networks. Brad despised the dark dirt under my fingernails, but he had absolutely no idea that the dirt was heavily regulated industrial byproduct that generated tens of millions of dollars in corporate revenue. Whenever I used to come home from a massive site inspection, Brad would literally hold his nose and step away from me, disgusted by the scent of industrial labor. And now the absolute pinnacle of cosmic irony had officially arrived. The arrogant financial consultant, the man who refused to shake my hand without immediately wiping his own with a sanitized wipe, was entirely buried under the very industrial waste he found so deeply repulsive. He thought he was stealing a pristine, valuable suburban asset to liquidate for easy cash to save himself from the Internal Revenue Service. Instead, his aggressive, unyielding greed had legally bound him to the absolute dirtiest, most hazardous aspect of my profession. He was now the proud sole owner of a commercial toxic waste site. The heavy, unforgiving burden of the working class he so deeply loathed had just been dropped directly onto his tailored shoulders. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, savoring the rich, bold flavor as a blue heron gracefully took flight across the water. "I am not calling anyone Brad," I said, my voice cutting through his panicked breathing with surgical, unwavering precision. "And there is absolutely no fraud here. You drafted the quitclaim deed, you brought your own lawyer, you chose the location for the signing, you practically forced the pen into my hand while threatening me with a spliced video. I simply gave you exactly what you demanded." Brad let out a choked, desperate noise, his breathing growing increasingly ragged. "You knew about the chemicals," he accused, his voice shaking with terror. "You intentionally withheld the environmental status of the property." I let out a short, cold laugh. "The environmental status of that property is a matter of public record, Brad. It has been federally registered for years. Any competent financial consultant or real estate attorney would have pulled the property disclosures and municipal zoning history before demanding a direct, unshielded title transfer. But you were too busy looking down your nose at me to look up the basic legal facts." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch across the phone line, making absolutely sure he hung on to every single word I was about to deliver. "You always acted like you were the smartest man in the room. You loved playing the brilliant, highly educated white financial guru dealing with the naive, simple-minded black plumber. Well, Mr. Hayes, you are the smart white guy. You are the financial genius. Why did you not read the fine print on the sales contract? Why did you not execute a basic title search before stealing my house?" The utter humiliation embedded in my words was the final, devastating strike to his fractured ego. The phone line went dead silent for a fraction of a second before Brad completely snapped. He unleashed a guttural, terrifying roar of pure, unfiltered hatred, the sound of a man who realized his entire existence was over. "Where are you?" he screamed, his voice tearing violently at his vocal cords. "Where are you hiding, you old piece of garbage? I am going to find you and I am going to kill you." I simply pressed the end call button and placed the phone face down on the patio table. Miles away, standing in the driveway of his toxic nightmare, Brad hurled his cell phone furiously onto the grass. He shoved Jada violently out of his way, practically ripping the door of his leased luxury SUV off its hinges. He slammed his foot violently onto the gas pedal, the heavy engine roaring as he tore out of the neighborhood in a blind, homicidal rage to hunt me down. I watched the live feed from my perimeter security cameras as the final act of Brad's arrogant rampage began to unfold. He must have pulled the corporate registry filings for my trust during his manic episode to locate my actual address. He did not care about subtlety or legal boundaries anymore. His leased black luxury SUV came tearing down the private tree-lined road leading to my estate at a dangerous speed. He did not even tap the brakes when he reached my imposing wrought iron security gates. He slammed his foot aggressively onto the accelerator and rammed the 2-ton vehicle directly into the metal. The impact was deafening. The front bumper of his luxury car crumpled like cheap tinfoil, the headlight shattering into 1,000 pieces, but the sheer force burst the electronic hinges open. He skidded onto my pristine circular driveway, tearing up the expensive landscaping, and slammed the ruined vehicle into park. Jada was sitting in the passenger seat. She had clearly fed off his manic, desperate energy the entire drive over. Brad kicked his door open and marched to the rear of the smoking SUV. He popped the trunk and pulled out a massive, heavy steel crowbar. His face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pure homicidal fury. He stomped up the wide stone steps leading to my grand entryway. Jada stumbled out of the passenger side, standing on the ruined grass in her expensive heels. "Get him, Brad!" she screamed, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "Make that selfish old man fix this. Force him to sign the reversal. Do not let him get away with ruining our lives." Brad did not hesitate. He raised the heavy steel crowbar high above his head and swung it with all his might directly into my custom floor-to-ceiling glass front doors. The reinforced glass held for the first strike spiderwebbing with a loud, violent crack. Brad roared like a wild animal, swinging again and again until the pain finally gave way, raining sharp shards all over my polished marble foyer. He stepped through the broken frame, crunching glass under his expensive leather shoes, tightly gripping the crowbar and screaming my name into the quiet house. I stood perfectly still on the second-floor interior balcony, looking down at the grand foyer. I held my control tablet in my hand, my thumb hovering over the master interface. Brad honestly believed he was breaking into the soft, vulnerable home of a retired, defenseless old man. He thought this estate was nothing more than a pretty architectural showcase with a standard off-the-shelf residential alarm system. He was making the exact same arrogant mistake he had made his entire life. He severely underestimated the quiet, calculating mind of a blue-collar tradesman. Over my 40-year career, my commercial plumbing firm did not just service basic office buildings. We held massive, highly classified government contracts. We laid the foundational infrastructure for maximum security Federal Reserve banks, pharmaceutical research laboratories, and state correctional facilities. I spent decades studying the absolute highest echelons of commercial security architecture because I had to route industrial pipes directly through their blast-proof walls and subterranean vaults. When I built this lakefront estate for myself, I did not hire a standard residential contractor to handle the safety protocols. I personally designed and installed a Level 4 commercial security matrix, seamlessly integrating military-grade defense mechanisms directly into the elegant framework of the house. The pristine drywall hid reinforced titanium support beams. The massive picture windows overlooking the lake were not standard glass. They were 2-inch thick ballistic polymer designed to withstand sustained gunfire and explosive impacts. The entire property was an impenetrable fortress disguised as a peaceful luxury retreat. Brad thought he had forcefully breached my defenses by smashing the front door with a piece of iron. He did not realize that the perimeter glass was specifically designed as a funnel. I wanted him to break in. I had purposely left the front gates unreinforced so he could ram his way onto the property. He had not broken into my sanctuary. He had willingly walked directly into a highly sophisticated, inescapable vault. Brad marched deeper into the center of my massive living room, violently swinging the crowbar into a priceless ceramic vase resting on an entryway table. It shattered into dust, scattering across the expensive Persian rug. "Where are you, Leon?" Brad roared, his voice echoing harshly off the high, vaulted ceilings. "Come down here right now and fix the deed. I will beat you within an inch of your life if you do not undo that federal contract right this second." Outside on the lawn, Jada was jumping up and down, completely swept up in the violent adrenaline of the moment. "Tear the place apart until he comes out," she screamed through the shattered doorway. "Find his safe, make him pay." I looked down at the pathetic, violent display from the safety of the second floor. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I felt the cold, mechanical precision of absolute justice. With a steady hand, I pressed the large red icon on my tablet. The house reacted with terrifying, instantaneous violence. A deafening 130-decibel commercial security siren erupted from hidden speakers in every corner of the ceiling. The sound was physically agonizing, designed to disorient and incapacitate armed intruders. Blinding, high-intensity strobe lights began flashing rapidly from the recessed lighting fixtures, plunging the living room into a chaotic, strobe-lit nightmare. Brad dropped his hands to his ears, crying out in pain, completely blinded by the relentless flashing lights. Then came the sound of heavy industrial machinery engaging. Solid, 2-inch thick steel interlocking shutters rapidly dropped from hidden tracks above every single window and exterior door on the ground floor. They slammed into the reinforced floor-locking mechanisms with a synchronized earth-shaking boom. A massive steel grate plummeted down right over the shattered front entrance, instantly sealing the gap. Jada shrieked in terror as the metal wall slammed down inches from her face, completely cutting her off from her husband. Brad was instantly trapped inside a windowless, inescapable steel box. I stepped forward, walking right up to the edge of the interior balcony. The railing was not open air. It was enclosed by a solid wall of floor-to-ceiling tempered ballistic glass. I stood there bathed in the flashing emergency lights, looking down at the man who had assaulted me with a wooden chair just days prior. Brad stumbled blindly, coughing in the dusty air, violently swinging his crowbar against the steel shutters blocking the front door. The heavy metal did not even dent. The crowbar simply bounced off, sending painful shockwaves up his arms. He dropped the weapon, his chest heaving with sheer panic, and looked up to the second floor. He saw me standing behind the impenetrable glass, perfectly calm, entirely untouchable. I simply crossed my arms and watched his arrogant bravado shatter into millions of tiny pieces. Suddenly cutting through the deafening wail of the house alarm, another sound pierced the morning air. The high-pitched aggressive wail of multiple police sirens echoed from the distance. The sound was multiplying, approaching rapidly from both ends of my private access road. There was no back exit. There was no hidden escape route. The only way out was completely blocked by an approaching wall of flashing blue lights. 4 heavily armored police cruisers skidded to a halt on the shredded grass of my front lawn, their tires tearing deep gashes into the manicured turf. The deafening wail of the sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the sharp, crackling static of police radios and the heavy slam of car doors. A dozen officers poured out of the vehicles with their weapons drawn, responding to the automated Level 4 commercial distress signal my security system had beamed directly to the local precinct. The flashing red and blue lights painted the exterior of my steel-encased home in chaotic, frantic strokes. Down on the lawn, the moment Jada saw the uniforms, her entire demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. The feral, aggressive woman who had just been screaming for her husband to tear my house apart vanished completely. In her place stood a fragile, hysterical victim. She sprinted toward the commanding officer, throwing her hands in the air and sobbing violently. She pointed a trembling finger at the massive steel grate covering the front door. "You have to help my husband," Jada shrieked, her voice cracking with perfectly manufactured terror. "My father has completely lost his mind. He is suffering from severe dementia and he lured us out here. He trapped Brad inside that metal box and he is going to kill him. Please, you have to break down that wall and save him. He is holding him hostage." The officers assessing the fortified structure and the weeping woman in expensive clothes immediately took defensive positions behind their vehicles, shouting through a megaphone for me to disengage the security locks and step outside with my hands visible. I stood behind the ballistic glass on the second floor, looking down at the daughter I had raised, and felt a cold, hollow ache settle deep inside my chest. This was the defining moment. This was the absolute, irrevocable severing of our blood tie. Any lingering, foolish hope I held that Jada was simply a misguided victim of Brad's manipulation completely dissolved into the sterile air of my fortified home. I watched her weep and gesture wildly, actively feeding armed police officers a calculated lie that could have easily resulted in my house being raided or my life being taken. I thought about the decades I had spent sacrificing my own comfort for her happiness. I remembered working double shifts in flooded municipal basements just to afford the tuition for her elite private academy. I remembered sitting in the front row of her college graduation, tears of pride in my eyes, believing I had successfully given her the tools to become a strong, honorable woman. I had given her everything, and in return, she was standing on my ruined lawn, desperately trying to frame me for a federal crime just to protect a failing, abusive con artist. The pain of watching your own flesh and blood actively plot your destruction is a unique, suffocating kind of agony. It burns through your memories and leaves nothing but ash. But as I watched Jada wipe away her fake tears, the pain quickly solidified into a permanent, unbreakable resolve. Evelyn had been right. Our daughter had become entirely consumed by greed. She was no longer the little girl who used to wait for my plumbing truck to pull into the driveway. She was a hostile adversary. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt the mechanical, ruthless necessity of finishing the lesson I had started. I was going to let the legal system entirely dismantle her fabricated reality. The commanding officer raised his megaphone again, his voice echoing loudly over the property, demanding I release the lockdown. Before I even had to reach for my control tablet to lower the volume of the house alarm, a sleek, silver luxury sedan calmly bypassed the perimeter of police cruisers and parked neatly at the edge of the driveway. The driver's side door opened and Richard Thorne stepped out into the chaotic scene. My attorney did not look panicked. He looked like a man arriving for a highly anticipated business meeting. He adjusted his suit jacket, grabbed his premium leather briefcase, and walked straight past a weeping Jada without even glancing in her direction. He approached the commanding officer with absolute, unwavering authority. "Officer, stand your men down and lower your weapons." Richard stated, his voice carrying the sharp, unmistakable tone of a high-powered corporate lawyer who dictated terms to federal judges for a living. "There is no hostage situation occurring on this property. The man trapped inside that security vestibule is a violent intruder, and the woman crying on the lawn is his willing accomplice." The commanding officer frowned, lowering the megaphone but keeping his hand near his holster. "Who are you?" the officer demanded. Richard snapped his briefcase open and pulled out a thick, legally certified document bearing the official seal of the state of Georgia. I am Richard Thorne, Senior Legal Counsel for Mr. Leon Crawford, the sole owner of this estate. What you are currently responding to is a textbook home invasion. Richard handed the document directly to the officer. 2 days ago, a Superior Court judge reviewed high-definition security footage of that man violently assaulting my client with a wooden chair, followed by footage of him attempting to kick down my client's front door at 2 in the morning. The judge immediately granted a permanent zero-tolerance restraining order. That document explicitly forbids Bradley Hayes and Jada Hayes from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Crawford or any residential property registered under his corporate trust. The commanding officer quickly scanned the legal document, his eyes widening as he read the strict judicial mandates and the specific vehicle descriptions listed in the order. He looked up from the paper, his gaze shifting from Richard to the smoking, crumpled luxury SUV embedded in my wrought iron gates, and finally to Jada, whose fake tears had instantly dried up, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She realized the trap was completely inescapable. I watched from the balcony and pressed a single button on my tablet. The massive steel grate covering the front entrance slowly began to rise with a heavy mechanical grind. Brad immediately spilled out onto the front porch, dropping his crowbar, gasping for fresh air, and raising his hands toward the police in a desperate gesture of relief. "Thank God," Brad coughed, pointing up at my window. "Arrest that crazy old man. He locked me in there." The officers did not look up at me. They moved with swift tactical precision, grabbing Brad by both arms, spinning him around violently, and slamming him face first against the side of a police cruiser. For the second time in a single week, the cold, unforgiving steel of police handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. "You are under arrest for felony breaking and entering, malicious destruction of property, and severe violation of a permanent judicial protection order," the commanding officer barked, pressing Brad firmly against the hood of the car. "And this time there will be absolutely no bail." Richard and I followed the police convoy to the downtown Atlanta precinct. I did not ride in the back of a police cruiser. I rode in the plush passenger seat of Richard's luxury sedan, sipping a fresh bottle of sparkling water while my high-powered corporate lawyer reviewed his meticulously organized case files. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the highway, casting a rhythmic glow over the asphalt. When we arrived at the heavily guarded station, the chief of police greeted us personally at the secure side entrance. He escorted us directly into a private soundproof observation room. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh fluorescent light spilling through the large one-way mirror mounted securely on the concrete wall. On the other side of that reinforced glass sat Brad. He was locked inside a stark, windowless interrogation room, his hands cuffed tightly to a heavy metal table bolted firmly to the floor. The expensive designer suit he prized so highly was completely ruined. The fabric was torn at the shoulder, violently wrinkled, and covered in thick gray dust from my steel security shutters. His arrogant venture capital persona had completely evaporated into the sterile air of the police station. He was no longer the smug, condescending financial guru who threw a solid oak chair at my head. He was a terrified, cornered animal facing the absolute destruction of his entire life. 2 seasoned detectives entered the room, dropping a massive stack of federal and state files onto the metal table with a loud, intimidating thud. They did not even have to start their formal questioning before Brad completely cracked under the immense psychological pressure. He leaned forward, sweating profusely under the harsh lights, and began frantically throwing the woman he swore to love and protect entirely under the bus. "It was all Jada," Brad cried out, his voice cracking with cowardly desperation and panic. "You have to believe me, officers." Demanded we forcefully move into his house because we lost our penthouse. She was the one who drafted that fake quitclaim deed and pressured me into making him sign it at the lawyer's office. I am just a financial consultant. I do not know anything about real estate fraud or toxic waste sites. She manipulated me because she wanted his money to fund her shopping habits. He sat there crying real pathetic tears, actively trying to send my daughter to a federal penitentiary for decades, just to shave a few years off his own inevitable prison sentence. He claimed he was a helpless victim of domestic manipulation, entirely ignorant of the highly illegal actions taken against my estate. He painted himself as a naive, devoted husband who was just trying to support his greedy, vindictive wife. I stood perfectly still in the observation room, watching the sheer cowardice radiating from the man on the other side of the glass. I felt absolutely no pity for him. I only felt a deep, profound disgust. Evelyn had been right about him from the very beginning. He was a parasite who only cared about his own survival. Richard stood next to me, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the pathetic display with the detached amusement of an apex predator observing trapped prey. While Brad continued to spin his frantic web of blatant lies to the detectives, Richard calmly reached into his premium leather briefcase. He pulled out a small, heavily encrypted digital storage drive and handed it directly to the chief of police standing beside us. The chief raised an inquiring eyebrow, questioning the contents of the device. Richard did not smile. He simply instructed the chief to have his detectives play the primary audio file labeled medical fraud right in front of the suspect. That specific digital drive contained the pristine, high-fidelity audio recording I had captured just days prior when Dr. Aris visited my home. I had anticipated that Brad would inevitably attempt to lie his way out of any legal corner, so I had meticulously gathered the exact evidence needed to strip away his defenses before he even had the chance to build them. When Brad had aggressively bribed that disgraced fraudulent psychiatrist to falsify a diagnosis of severe dementia, he thought he was executing a brilliant, untraceable white-collar crime. He assumed that because I wore faded work boots and had spent my life routing commercial sewage pipes, I was far too stupid to understand the complexities of medical fraud or corporate extortion. He never considered that the quiet old plumber he constantly mocked possessed the technological capability to record his illegal transactions. He never realized that the $10,000 cash bribe he had handed to Dr. Aris was a direct admission of guilt perfectly captured on a digital microphone fastened securely beneath my kitchen table. Dr. Aris had loudly and explicitly named Brad as the sole financier of the fraudulent medical competency evaluation. He had outlined the exact cash amount Brad paid him to forcefully remove me from my own home and lock me inside a psychiatric facility. The recording was not just circumstantial evidence. It was an ironclad, undeniable confession that Brad was the primary architect of the entire conspiracy. He was not a victim of his wife's manipulation. He was a ruthless, calculating criminal who had actively purchased illegal medical documents to steal an $800,000 estate and mask his catastrophic federal tax debts. Through the glass, I watched the lead detective hold a finger to his earpiece, receiving the direct order from the chief in our observation room. The detective nodded slightly, holding up a firm hand to stop Brad's frantic, blubbering monologue. He pulled a small digital media player from his pocket, plugged it into a portable speaker resting on the metal table, and pressed play. The crisp, clear audio of Dr. Aris's voice instantly filled the stark interrogation room. Brad was absolutely right, the doctor's recorded voice chuckled with arrogant satisfaction. "You are completely gone, old man. You do not even know what decade you are living in. This is going to be the easiest $10,000 I have ever made in my career." The recording echoed sharply off the concrete walls. Brad's mouth hung wide open. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickening pale gray. The frantic energy he had used to throw Jada under the bus completely vanished, replaced by an absolute suffocating terror. He stared at the small speaker as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The detective leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the metal table, getting inches away from Brad's face. "You were saying you had absolutely no knowledge of the fraud," the detective stated, his voice dripping with heavy, unmistakable sarcasm. "Because this audio file, which was just submitted into official state evidence by Mr. Crawford's legal team, explicitly names you as the sole individual who orchestrated a $10,000 cash bribe to a corrupt medical official. We also have the bank withdrawal logs from your remaining open accounts that perfectly match the date and amount of this specific cash bribe." The detective paused, letting the crushing weight of the evidence fully settle onto Brad's trembling shoulders. "You are not a victim of your wife, Bradley. You are the architect of a massive multi-tiered extortion plot against a senior citizen. Your entire statement today is a documented lie, and you just committed perjury by providing a false sworn confession to federal investigators." Brad began to hyperventilate. He pulled frantically against the steel handcuffs, his chest heaving as the inescapable reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He had no defense. He had no high-priced lawyers left to bail him out. He had no money to bribe a judge. He was completely and utterly ruined by the very man he thought was too stupid to fight back. Brad slumped forward in his metal chair, resting his forehead against the cold table, letting out a pathetic, defeated whimper. "I will cooperate," he sobbed heavily, the remaining shreds of his dignity dissolving into the sterile air of the police station. "I will testify against her in court. I will tell you everything Jada did to help me hide the money offshore. I will sign whatever you want if you just promise to protect me from federal prison." The lead detective did not offer a comforting smile. He simply stood up straight and looked down at the broken man with utter contempt. "You do not have anything left to bargain with, Bradley," the detective said coldly. "And you should probably know that your wife is not sitting in a holding cell downstairs. We put her in the observation room right next door, and we left the intercom speaker turned all the way up. She just sat there and listened to you beg us to send her to federal prison to save your own skin." The detective picked up his files and walked toward the heavy steel door. "She is cooperating fully with the district attorney," the detective added, looking back over his shoulder. "And she requested a pen. She is signing the divorce papers right now." The fluorescent lights of the county courthouse buzzed with a dull, sterile hum, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany benches. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the violent altercation in my living room, and the preliminary hearing for the felony assault charge had finally arrived. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a crisp, tailored charcoal suit, waiting patiently for the proceedings to begin. When the heavy wooden side doors opened, 2 armed bailiffs escorted Brad into the courtroom. The transformation was absolute and pathetic. He was no longer wearing his custom Italian suits or flashing his expensive luxury watch. He was dressed in standard-issue oversized Orange County jail scrubs, his wrists bound together by heavy steel chains. He looked pale, gaunt, and completely stripped of his signature corporate arrogance. He shuffled to the defense table and kept his eyes firmly fixed on the floor, unable to even glance in my direction. Since all of his assets were completely frozen by the Internal Revenue Service, he could not afford the high-powered defense team he desperately needed. Instead, he was represented by a public defender who looked entirely overworked and deeply exhausted by the mountain of federal and state charges piled against his client. When the judge called the court to order, Brad's defense attorney immediately launched into a frantic, desperate attempt to minimize the severity of the crime. He paced in front of the judge, gesturing wildly, trying to paint a picture of a loving family pushed to the absolute brink by modern financial stress. "Your Honor," the defense attorney pleaded, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "My client is a hard-working financial consultant who was experiencing an unprecedented amount of professional anxiety. What happened in that house was not a calculated, malicious assault. It was a highly emotional family dispute that unfortunately escalated. It was a momentary lapse in judgment." The defense attorney pointed toward me, attempting to twist the narrative to make me look like the aggressor. He argued that the injuries I sustained were minor, requiring only a few stitches, and that a wooden dining chair should not be classified as a deadly weapon under these specific domestic circumstances. He practically begged the judge to reduce the felony aggravated assault charge to a simple misdemeanor, claiming that putting a man with no prior criminal record into the state penitentiary for a family misunderstanding would be an absolute miscarriage of justice. I listened to his ridiculous, fabricated narrative without showing a single trace of emotion on my face. When the prosecutor finally called my name, I stood up slowly, adjusting my suit jacket, and walked with deliberate, measured steps toward the witness stand. I raised my right hand, placed my left hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. I sat down in the wooden chair, resting my calloused, scarred hands on the railing. The defense attorney immediately attempted to rattle my composure. He approached the stand aggressively, asking rapid-fire leading questions designed to make me look like a difficult, uncooperative, and stubborn old man who had intentionally provoked his stressed son-in-law. He asked if I harbored deep resentment toward Brad. He asked if I had deliberately insulted his career to spark a physical confrontation. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or let his aggressive tactics bait me into a defensive emotional response. I looked directly past the frantic lawyer and focused my gaze entirely on the judge. I spoke with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a man who had spent 40 years building commercial plumbing infrastructure through honest, grueling labor. I explained the exact sequence of events with absolute chilling clarity. "I am a 69-year-old man," I stated, my voice echoing deeply through the silent courtroom. I was sitting quietly in the home that I purchased and paid for with decades of manual labor. My daughter and her husband entered my house uninvited, threw their luggage onto my floor, and ordered me to vacate my own master bedroom and move into the damp basement. When I calmly refused their demand, he resorted to immediate extreme violence. I did not embellish the pain of the impact. I did not try to squeeze fake tears out of my eyes to gain the sympathy of the court. I simply stated the undeniable facts. A younger, significantly stronger man picked up a heavy, solid oak piece of furniture and launched it directly at my skull because I refused to surrender my personal property to him. My absolute composure, my steady voice, and my unwavering gaze completely overpowered the defense attorney's deceitful narrative. The lawyer physically deflated, realizing that he could not bully or confuse a man who possessed no fear and had nothing to hide. The prosecutor then stood up and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the state would like to submit Exhibit A into the official evidentiary record," the prosecutor announced confidently. "We have the unedited high-definition security footage captured directly from Mr. Crawford's living room cameras on the exact date and time of the incident." The judge nodded, and the courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a large flat-screen television was rolled to the center of the room. Brad sank lower into his chair, physically burying his face in his chained hands as the video began to play. The footage played in stark, undeniable, and brutal clarity. The judge and the entire gallery watched as Brad stormed into the camera frame, his face twisted in a mask of pure, entitled rage. They heard the crystal-clear audio of his verbal abuse, listening to him call me an ignorant old laborer. And then they watched the exact moment he grabbed the heavy oak chair. The video completely destroyed the defense attorney's claim that this was a reckless, accidental toss born out of sudden stress. The high-definition footage showed Brad planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, winding his arms back and hurling the solid wood object with maximum deliberate velocity directly at my head. The collective gasp in the courtroom was highly audible. The video showed the chair shattering violently against my face, my blood instantly spilling down my neck and staining my shirt. It showed the sheer brutality of a younger man trying to inflict maximum physical damage on a senior citizen. Just as damning, the footage captured Jada standing completely motionless in the background. It showed her actively refusing to offer any medical assistance while her bleeding father stood in front of her, choosing instead to scream that I was being selfish. The defense attorney dropped his pen onto his table, shaking his head. He knew his entire defense was completely obliterated by the harsh digital reality of a malicious, highly calculated attack. As the lights in the courtroom turned back on, the defense attorney made one final desperate plea to the judge. He requested that Brad be released on bail pending the final criminal trial, arguing that he needed to return home to prepare his legal defense and handle his complex financial affairs. The prosecutor immediately objected, citing the extreme violence shown in the video. The judge did not even bother to look up from his legal notes. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that sealed Brad's fate. Based on the extremely violent and unprovoked nature of this assault against a senior citizen, the judge declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. And combining that with the defendant's active federal indictments involving international wire fraud, offshore shell accounts, and massive unsettled debts to the Internal Revenue Service, I deem this man an extreme flight risk and a severe danger to the community. Bail is unequivocally denied. The defendant will be remanded to county custody until the trial date. Remove him from my courtroom. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the pristine surface of my private lake, casting a warm golden glow across the cedar deck of my estate. I was standing in my spacious kitchen pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee when the automated chime of my perimeter security system broke the absolute silence. I walked over to the wall-mounted control panel and pulled up the live video feed from the main entry gates. Standing on the other side of the heavy wrought iron barricade was my daughter. Jada had somehow managed to track down the heavily guarded address of my corporate trust. She did not look like the fiercely arrogant, entitled woman who had stood on my front porch just weeks prior, demanding I pack my bags for the basement. Her expensive designer clothing looked rumpled and slept in. Her hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, was pulled back in a messy, chaotic knot. Her face was pale, completely devoid of makeup, revealing deep, dark circles of profound exhaustion and panic. She pressed the intercom button repeatedly with a trembling finger, looking directly into the camera lens with wide, desperate eyes. I did not buzz her in. I put on my jacket, walked out the front door, and took a slow, deliberate walk down the long paved driveway toward the security gates. When I reached the heavy iron bars, Jada immediately dropped to her knees on the hard, decorative cobblestone. She gripped the metal bars with both hands, sobbing uncontrollably, her tears falling freely onto the pavement. "Dad, you have to help me," she wailed, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Please, you are the only one left. The Environmental Protection Agency is destroying my life. Brad is sitting in a county jail cell without bail, and because I am still legally married to him, the federal government is coming after me for the toxic waste penalty. They slapped a $1.2 million fine on that suburban house. I do not have that kind of money. My accounts are completely frozen because of Brad's tax fraud. I am going to be arrested." She pressed her face against the cold iron, playing the ultimate victim card. "You know I did not understand what was happening. Brad manipulated me. He controlled our finances. He lied to me about his success, and he forced me to treat you that way. You know I love you. Please, Dad, you have to save your little girl." I stood on my side of the gate, looking down at the weeping woman who had eagerly watched her husband hurl a solid oak chair at my skull. I felt absolutely no warmth. I felt no protective fatherly instinct. Her tears were completely hollow, born entirely out of self-preservation, rather than genuine remorse. I did not reach through the bars to comfort her. Instead, I calmly reached inside my jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily worn leather-bound accounting ledger. It was an old physical record book I had kept perfectly preserved for over a decade. I slid the heavy book through the gap in the iron gate. It landed on the cobblestone right in front of Jada's knees with a heavy, definitive thud. "Open it," I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Read the highlighted transaction on the very first page." Jada sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. She slowly reached out, opened the worn leather cover, and looked at the faded ink. 10 years ago, Brad was a failing, incompetent junior analyst who had just been fired from his first corporate job. He was completely broke, drowning in student debt, and entirely incapable of securing a traditional business loan to start his own venture capital firm. He told Jada and everyone else who would listen that a brilliant anonymous angel investor had recognized his undeniable genius and graciously provided the $2 million seed capital required to launch his entire career. Brad built his entire arrogant white-collar identity around the myth that he was a self-made corporate prodigy. Look at the name of the holding company that issued that initial $2 million wire transfer, I instructed, watching her eyes scan the page. Jada read the corporate entity listed on the old ledger, and then her eyes slowly traced the ownership lineage mapped out in my handwriting right next to it. The color completely drained from her face. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp. That anonymous angel investor was not a Wall Street billionaire. It was a blind trust entirely funded and controlled by a blue-collar commercial plumber named Leon Crawford. Every single tailored suit Brad ever wore, every expensive dinner he ever purchased to impress his shallow friends, the luxury cars he leased, and the downtown penthouse he flaunted, it was all entirely paid for by the very same dirt and sewage pipes he so viciously mocked. I bought his career. I stated the cold truth, slicing through the morning air like a surgical scalpel. Your husband never built a single thing in his pathetic life. I quietly funded his entire firm because Evelyn begged me to make sure you were financially secure. I gave him the foundation to become a massive success, and instead of building something honorable, he used my money to construct a fraudulent, arrogant illusion. He spent a decade looking down on the very man who put the food on his table. And you, Jada, you stood right beside him, completely blinded by fake wealth, actively choosing a worthless parasite over the father who sacrificed his own body to give you the world. Jada stared at the ledger, her hands shaking violently. The entire reality of her adult life had just been utterly obliterated. The absolute superiority she felt over my modest working-class lifestyle was completely exposed as a humiliating, monumental joke. She had thrown away her devoted father for a man who was literally surviving on my quiet charity. But Dad, Jada stammered, her voice barely a whisper. If you have this kind of massive wealth, if you are this powerful, then you can fix the EPA disaster right now. You can easily pay off the federal penalty. You can hire the best lawyers in the country to separate my name from Brad's criminal indictments. You can save me from going to prison. Please just wire the money. It will not even affect you. I looked down at her, maintaining absolute chilling eye contact. I could wipe out that $1.2 million environmental debt with a single snap of my fingers, I said, my voice resonating with deep, unshakable authority. I could make a single phone call to Richard Thorne and have your entire legal nightmare erased before lunchtime. It would not even make a microscopic dent in my financial portfolio. I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the absolute finality of my next words. But I refuse. I am not going to give you a single dime. Jada let out a devastating, heartbroken wail, gripping the iron bars tighter. Why, she screamed, fresh tears streaming down her face. Because you need to understand the true cost of your greed, I replied coldly. You demanded my house. You demanded my property. You demanded that I crawl into a dark basement so you could live comfortably on my dime. Well, you got exactly what you wanted. That toxic, hazardous house, that massive, crushing federal debt, and the absolute permanent destruction of your fake corporate lifestyle. That is my final dowry to you. You chose your husband. You chose his arrogance. Now you get to keep his garbage. I turned my back on her and began walking slowly up the long, paved driveway toward my peaceful, quiet estate. Jada screamed my name, begging and pleading for me to come back, her hands reaching desperately through the iron bars. I did not turn around. I did not stop walking. As I reached the front steps of my house, a plain, unremarkable silver sedan pulled up to the curb directly behind where Jada was kneeling on the street. A man wearing a simple gray suit stepped out of the vehicle holding a thick, bright yellow manila envelope. He walked right up to my weeping daughter. Jada Hayes. The man asked, his tone strictly professional and devoid of any sympathy. Jada slowly looked up, her eyes red and swollen, too exhausted to even formulate a response. The man simply dropped the heavy yellow envelope directly into her lap. You have been officially served by the United States Federal Court, he announced loudly, turning on his heel and walking back to his car. You are required to appear for your grand jury indictment regarding international wire fraud. Have a good morning. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta swung shut, sealing the courtroom in a tense and suffocating silence. 3 weeks had passed since Jada received her grand jury indictment on the driveway of my estate. Today was the final financial reckoning. I sat in the second row of the gallery wearing a pristine navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight. Richard Thorne sat beside me, silently observing the masterpiece of legal destruction we had orchestrated together. At the prosecution table stood the lead counsel for the Internal Revenue Service. He was a tall, ruthless government lawyer holding a thick binder containing the entire fabricated financial history of Bradley Hayes. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals, adjusted her glasses and read through the final asset forfeiture decree. The words she spoke echoed through the cavernous room like a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of absolute doom. The Internal Revenue Service had successfully pierced the corporate veil of Brad's offshore shell companies. The judge officially declared a complete and total freeze on every single financial asset tied to Brad and Jada. The luxury downtown penthouse was formally seized by the bank. The leased vehicles were repossessed by the dealerships. The Cayman Islands accounts were entirely drained and repatriated to the United States Treasury to satisfy the massive tax evasion penalties. Jada sat frozen at the defense table, her hands covering her face as she listened to the federal government systematically strip away every single luxury item, every designer handbag, and every stolen dollar she had foolishly believed elevated her above her working-class father. The illusion of their massive wealth was officially dead, replaced by the crushing, inescapable reality of absolute zero. I shifted my gaze toward Brad. The man standing before the federal judge was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, sneering venture capitalist who had violently demanded I move into my own damp basement. Because the local magistrate had unequivocally denied his bail after viewing the security footage of his unprovoked assault against me, Brad had spent the last several weeks rotting inside a county jail cell. The harsh, unforgiving reality of incarceration had entirely broken his spirit. He was dressed in a faded, oversized orange prison jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished hardwood floor every time he nervously shifted his weight. His expensive, meticulously styled haircut was now a greasy, overgrown mess. The dark circles under his eyes looked like permanent, heavy bruises. He was visibly trembling. The man who had once laughed at my calloused hands, who had mockingly called me an ignorant old laborer, while sipping vintage wine he stole from my private cellar, was now reduced to a pathetic, shivering shell of a human being. He had lost his prestigious firm. He had lost his fake reputation. He had lost the respect of his shallow corporate friends who abandoned him the exact second the federal indictments became public record. The gallery behind me was packed with local journalists and financial reporters, all furiously typing on their laptops, permanently cementing his public ruin into the digital archives of the internet. I looked at his shaking hands and felt an overwhelming sense of profound, quiet satisfaction. Evelyn had begged me to protect our daughter from this parasite. I had done exactly that by letting the parasite consume itself. Brad had spent his entire adult life looking down on honest working-class people. Now he was physically looking up at a federal judge begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. The federal prosecutor turned the page of his ledger and addressed the court regarding the final disposition of the defendant's remaining property. The Internal Revenue Service is seizing all liquid assets, all offshore accounts, and all equity in the downtown real estate to satisfy the $800,000 tax debt, the prosecutor stated clearly. However, the federal government formally declines to seize the suburban residential property recently transferred into the defendants' names. The judge nodded in agreement. The Internal Revenue Service is a highly efficient collection agency, and they possess zero interest in acquiring toxic liabilities. By taking direct ownership of my former home through that fraudulent quitclaim deed, Brad had legally bound himself to the registered commercial hazardous transit site located in the basement. The federal government would not touch that property with a 10-foot pole. It was legally contaminated. That meant the suburban house, complete with its pending $1.2 million environmental cleanup invoice from the Environmental Protection Agency, was the singular solitary asset Brad and Jada still legally owned. The judge looked down at Brad with absolute unyielding contempt. "Mr. Hayes, you possess zero liquid capital, you face severe federal prison time for wire fraud, and you are solely responsible for $1 million federal environmental penalty," the judge declared firmly. "You are entirely insolvent." Brad's public defender stood up, his voice weak and defeated, and officially requested that the court allow his client to file for Chapter 7 total bankruptcy. The judge granted the request, but instantly delivered the final, devastating blow. "You may file for bankruptcy to liquidate your remaining consumer debt," the judge clarified coldly. "But as your attorney should have informed you, federal environmental penalties issued by the Environmental Protection Agency are strictly non-dischargeable in any bankruptcy proceeding. That specific debt will follow you for the rest of your natural life." Brad physically collapsed into his wooden chair, burying his face in his chained hands. He had absolutely nothing left. He was penniless, publicly disgraced, saddled with an inescapable $1 million debt, and facing a guaranteed 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The judge struck her heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, officially adjourning the financial hearing and remanding Brad back to county custody to await his final criminal sentencing. The armed bailiff stepped forward, grabbing Brad roughly by the arms to haul him back to his concrete cell. As they turned him around to face the center aisle, his hollow, sunken eyes scanned the crowded gallery, his gaze locked directly onto mine. I was sitting perfectly still, my expression calm and utterly unbothered. Brad stopped walking, ignoring the heavy tug of the bailiffs on his shoulders. His chest heaved as the absolute crushing reality of his total destruction finally connected in his mind. He looked at my pristine suit, and then his eyes drifted to the fading scar on my cheek where he had struck me with the oak dining chair. "Did you plan all of this since that day?" Brad asked, his voice a hoarse, defeated whisper that barely carried over the noise of the shuffling courtroom. I looked him dead in the eyes, ensuring my words would haunt him for every single night he spent behind iron bars. "I planned it since long before you even picked up the chair," I replied. The heavy steel chains clinked with a sickening rhythmic finality as the armed bailiffs hauled Brad through the thick wooden side doors of the courtroom. The heavy latch clicked shut, echoing sharply in the cavernous mahogany-paneled space. Brad was gone, dragged back to a miserable concrete cell to await his inevitable transfer to a federal penitentiary. The courtroom, previously buzzing with the low murmur of financial reporters and legal clerks, suddenly fell deathly quiet. Jada had remained perfectly frozen at the defense table while the judge read the catastrophic asset forfeiture decree. But as the door slammed shut behind her husband, the shock instantly morphed into a blinding, irrational, and completely unhinged rage. She jolted to life, her chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. She stormed down the center aisle, her heels clicking aggressively as she marched directly toward where Richard and I were seated in the gallery. "You monster," Jada screamed, her voice cracking with a hysterical feral fury that made the remaining journalists immediately turn their digital recorders in her direction. "You cold-blooded, ruthless monster." She did not care about the audience. She did not care about the federal marshals standing near the exits. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest, her face twisted in absolute hatred. "You planned this entire nightmare just to destroy us. You set us up to lose every single thing we own. What kind of father does this to his own flesh and blood? You have tens of millions of dollars sitting in hidden bank accounts, and you just sat there and watched my husband get chained up like an animal. You ruined my life, Leon. You are completely psychotic." She deliberately dropped the title of Dad, referring to me by my first name, as if I were merely a hostile corporate rival who had executed a ruthless takeover of her life. She blamed me for the federal indictments. She blamed me for the Environmental Protection Agency penalty. In her completely fractured reality, she was the innocent victim of a wealthy, vindictive old man completely ignoring the massive mountain of fraud, assault, and tax evasion she and Brad had actively committed. I remained seated on the wooden gallery bench for a long moment, letting her frantic, hysterical accusations bounce completely off my armored composure. A profound, hollow ache settled deep within my chest. It was the ultimate decisive pain of a father realizing his child is truly gone. Looking at Jada now, her face contorted with pure entitlement, I knew that the sweet little girl who used to wait on the porch for my plumbing truck to pull into the driveway was dead. In her place stood a stranger entirely consumed by superficial greed and profound arrogance. She honestly believed that my sole purpose in life was to be an infinitely deep, silent bank account existing only to fund her disastrous mistakes and shield her from the brutal consequences of her own actions. I thought about the decades of grueling, backbreaking labor I had endured to build my commercial plumbing empire. I thought about the countless double shifts wading through toxic municipal waste, damaging my knees and scarring my hands just to ensure she never had to experience a single day of the crushing poverty I grew up in. I gave her the absolute best education, the safest neighborhoods, and a completely debt-free start to her adult life. I had poured every ounce of my love and energy into building a protective fortress around her. But she had willingly opened the gates to a manipulative parasite and proudly handed him the keys. When that parasite picked up a heavy oak dining chair and violently smashed it against my skull, Jada did not see a bleeding father. She only saw an inconvenient, stubborn obstacle standing between her and a master bedroom. The sacred familial bond between a father and a daughter was not severed by my aggressive legal retaliation or my financial maneuvering. It was permanently severed the exact moment she watched my blood hit the hardwood floor and chose to defend the man who drew it. Evelyn had begged me to protect our daughter from con artists, even if it meant breaking her heart. I was finally fulfilling that promise. True protection meant allowing the fire of consequence to burn away the rot she had welcomed into her life. I slowly stood up from the wooden bench, buttoning my tailored navy blue suit jacket with deliberate, unhurried precision. I stepped out into the center aisle, closing the physical distance between us. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical, echoing screams. I did not offer a defensive explanation or apologize for the federal justice system doing its job. I spoke with a low, heavy, and absolutely unyielding authority that immediately forced her to take an involuntary step backward. "I did not ruin your life, Jada," I stated, my voice cutting through the sterile air of the courthouse like a surgical blade. "You and your husband dug a massive, toxic, illegal hole, and I simply stopped throwing my money into it to fill it up." Jada opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but I held up a single, scarred hand, instantly silencing her. My calloused fingers were a stark reminder of the labor she so deeply despised. When that arrogant fool hurled a solid piece of wood at my face, my blood spilled onto the floor of the very house I built. I said my words dripping with absolute freezing clarity. I was bleeding from my face, and you did not even flinch. You did not rush over to see if I was severely injured. You did not call an ambulance. You looked down at your elderly father bleeding on the hardwood, and you yelled that I was being selfish. You were entirely willing to watch me be physically assaulted just so you could forcefully claim my bedroom and save yourselves from a foreclosure you caused. I took one final dominant step closer, my towering presence completely overshadowing her trembling frame. My gaze locked onto her terrified, tear-filled eyes, ensuring she felt the absolute weight of her catastrophic choices. I am not a monster. I continued delivering the final devastating verdict on our relationship. I am not cold-blooded, and I am not ruthless. I am simply closing the door that you actively and violently smashed to pieces. You chose your husband. You chose his arrogance, his fraud, and his blatant disrespect. You chose your path, Jada. Now you have to walk it entirely alone. The absolute freezing finality of my words finally fractured the fragile defensive illusion she had built around herself. The massive wall of denial shattered. The realization that she had completely exhausted her ultimate safety net, that there was no hidden trust fund coming to save her, hit her with the devastating force of a freight train. Her legs simply gave out. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed right there in the middle of the polished marble floor of the federal courthouse lobby. Her expensive designer dress crumpled around her as she dropped to the floor, letting out a devastating, breathless wail that echoed tragically up to the vaulted ceilings. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with a deep, primal panic. There was no wealthy, arrogant husband left to catch her. There was no forgiving, endlessly generous father left to write a massive check and make the scary government agents go away. She was completely bankrupt, facing her own looming federal fraud indictments, and entirely catastrophically alone. I looked down at her shaking form for one brief silent second. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer a single word of comfort or a shoulder to cry on. The time for rescuing her had long since passed. I simply turned my back on her weeping form, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked alongside my attorney toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the federal building, stepping out into the bright, unforgiving Atlanta sunlight, and walked toward my waiting vehicle without looking back. 6 months passed. The hot, oppressive Atlanta summer surrendered to a crisp, biting autumn, mirroring the absolute cooling of my once chaotic life. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding certainty, completely crushing anyone foolish enough to stand in its path. Brad was currently sitting in a tiny, windowless concrete cell at a medium-security federal correctional institution in Florida. His expensive tailored suits were permanently replaced by a rigid, scratchy khaki uniform. He was officially designated as inmate number 84720, spending his days scrubbing cafeteria trays and counting the 60 remaining months of his mandated sentence. He had lost his firm, his freedom, and his entire fraudulent identity. Jada had narrowly avoided sharing his exact fate. To escape federal prison, she had fully cooperated with the prosecutors, signing a devastating plea agreement that required her to surrender every single asset tied to her name. The bankruptcy courts and the Environmental Protection Agency systematically stripped her of everything. The luxury downtown penthouse was aggressively foreclosed upon by the bank. Her designer wardrobe, her leased luxury vehicles, and her high-limit credit cards were completely wiped from existence. She was evicted, humiliated, and left entirely destitute. To survive, to pay for her bare minimum living expenses, and chip away at the insurmountable mountain of non-dischargeable legal debt, my daughter was forced to enter the absolute bottom of the labor market. She secured a grueling minimum wage job working the overnight shift as a waitress at a greasy, rundown 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. The woman who once sipped vintage French wine and sneered at my working-class lifestyle was now spending her nights serving cheap burnt coffee to exhausted truck drivers and intoxicated college students. She was living in a cheap, unheated studio apartment, relying on public transportation, and surviving on the exact kind of meager wages she had spent her entire adult life mocking. She had no safety net, no rich husband, and absolutely no father left to rescue her from the miserable hole she had dug. The sheer absolute poetic justice of her current existence was impossible to ignore. For her entire life, Jada had looked down on manual labor. She had explicitly chosen Brad because he wore Italian leather shoes and carried a sleek briefcase, actively rejecting the honorable, calloused hands that had built her a life of extreme privilege. She thought getting her hands dirty was a sign of profound failure. Now dirt was her permanent reality. During a particularly busy night shift, a belligerent customer made a catastrophic mess in the diner restroom. The abrasive, underpaid shift manager did not call a specialized cleaning service. He walked right up to Jada, handed her a heavily stained mop and a bucket of cheap industrial bleach, and ordered her to clean the stalls immediately if she wanted to keep her job. The woman who used to demand that I vacate my own master bedroom so she could have more closet space was now forced to kneel on a sticky, cracked linoleum floor. She had to plunge clogged toilets and scrub biological waste from porcelain bowls. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails were completely gone, replaced by chipped, raw, and blistered fingertips. The harsh, toxic smell of cheap bleach and stale frying grease seeped permanently into her clothes and her skin. It was the exact same industrial scent I used to carry home after a grueling 14-hour shift laying commercial sewage pipes. It was the scent she used to complain about the scent she claimed embarrassed her in front of her shallow friends. Now it was her permanent perfume. She was experiencing the brutal, uncompromising reality of the working class, but without any of the honor, the corporate backing, or the immense hidden wealth I had possessed. She was completely broken, physically exhausted, and mentally drained. Every time she scrubbed a dirty floor or wiped down a sticky diner table, she had to live with the agonizing knowledge that she had actively chosen this exact fate. She had willingly traded an impenetrable fortress of family wealth for a cheap, crumbling illusion of corporate status. She had played a reckless game of greed and lost absolutely everything, left with nothing but a mop and a profound sense of ultimate regret. While Jada was spending her nights scrubbing industrial grime for pennies, I was making aggressive, highly strategic moves in the daylight. The bank that had officially seized Brad and Jada's luxury downtown penthouse finally put the distressed property up for public auction. The massive, sprawling unit was deeply underwater, burdened by multiple secondary liens and a severely damaged market reputation due to Brad's high-profile federal fraud conviction. Most legitimate buyers steered completely clear of the property, not wanting to touch an asset heavily associated with a criminal enterprise. I did not personally attend the foreclosure auction. I sat comfortably on the cedar deck of my lakefront estate while Richard Thorne attended the proceedings downtown, acting as the authorized legal representative for a highly insulated, anonymous private equity firm. That specific equity firm was entirely funded and controlled by my primary blind trust. Richard executed the bidding strategy with surgical precision. Because the property was so heavily distressed and the market interest was virtually non-existent, my trust purchased the multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse for absolute pennies on the dollar. I acquired the crown jewel of Brad's arrogant ego for a microscopic fraction of its original market value. I did not buy the penthouse to live in it, and I certainly did not buy it to preserve their memory. The very next day, I deployed my top commercial contracting crews to the site. I ordered them to violently rip out the custom Italian marble, tear down the ridiculous modern art fixtures, and completely gut the interior. We aggressively converted the space into premium, highly functional corporate lease offices. I transformed their fake, hollow symbol of superiority into a highly profitable, performing commercial asset. Every single month, the massive rental checks generated from their former luxury home are deposited directly into a high-yield community account. I took the physical manifestation of their profound greed and repurposed it to generate honest, clean revenue without them ever knowing I was the one pulling the strings behind the corporate curtain. Back at the rundown diner, the early morning sun was just beginning to peek through the grease-stained windows. Jada dragged the heavy mop bucket out of the restrooms, wiping a thick layer of toxic sweat from her forehead. Her back ached violently, and her feet were swollen from standing for 9 consecutive hours. She leaned heavily against the laminate counter to catch her breath and happened to look up at the small, staticky television mounted on the wall above the pie display. The local Atlanta morning news broadcast was airing a breaking financial philanthropy segment. The anchor was excitedly detailing a massive, unprecedented local donation. A high-definition, full-screen photograph flashed across the television. It was a crystal-clear image of me, Leon Crawford, wearing a tailored Navy suit, standing proudly in front of a newly established community center. The bold, scrolling headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Anonymous commercial plumbing magnate Leon Crawford steps into public spotlight, donates $5 million in cash to support victims of domestic financial abuse." Jada stared at the screen, her eyes widening in absolute horror as the heavy serving tray slipped directly out of her raw, blistered hands and crashed violently against the dirty floor. The morning sun spilled through the massive, ballistic glass windows of my lakefront estate, casting long, warm shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I was sitting quietly in my expansive dining room, gently running my calloused fingers over the smooth, varnished wood of the chair beneath me. It was the exact same solid oak dining chair that Brad had violently hurled at my face months ago. After the police had hauled him away in handcuffs, I had gathered every single shattered piece of that wood from the floor of my old suburban home. I did not throw it away. Instead, I handed the broken pieces to a master carpenter, a man who respected the history of hard work just as much as I did. He painstakingly reconstructed the chair, carefully binding the fractured wood with industrial epoxy and sealing it with a thick protective finish. The chair was whole again, but the deep, jagged scars of the impact remained highly visible along the backrest. I traced the raised grain of the repaired wood, then slowly brought my hand up to my own face. My fingers brushed against the thick, raised scar resting permanently on my cheekbone. When Brad struck me, he intended to leave a mark of submission. He wanted me to look in the mirror every single day and remember that I was a weak, powerless old man who had been violently conquered in his own home. He failed completely. This scar was not a brand of victimhood. It was my highest medal of honor. It was the undeniable physical proof of my absolute liberation. The dull ache that occasionally flared up in the cold weather did not remind me of pain. It reminded me of the exact moment I finally woke up, the moment I stopped being a silent provider and became an unstoppable force of nature. For 40 long, grueling years, my entire existence was defined by relentless sacrifice. I woke up at 4 in the morning every single day, strapping on heavy steel-toed work boots and walking out into the freezing dark. I spent my youth crawling through flooded commercial basements, breathing in the toxic fumes of industrial solvents and destroying the cartilage in my knees to build a contracting empire from the ground up. I did it all without a single word of complaint. I endured the physical agony because I wanted to provide a flawless, impenetrable shield of financial security for my family. I wanted to make absolutely certain that my daughter never had to experience the harsh, biting hunger of the poverty I grew up in. I wanted her to have the pristine private schools, the flawless dental care, and the beautiful clothes I could never afford as a young boy. But in my blind dedication to providing that perfect life, I made a critical error. I shielded Jada so thoroughly from the brutal realities of the world that she completely lost the ability to respect the hands that built her sanctuary. She mistook my quiet, humble nature for weakness. She looked at my faded flannel shirts and assumed I was foolish. She married an arrogant, abusive parasite because he wore shiny suits and spoke with aggressive corporate authority, entirely forgetting that real authority is forged in the fires of hard, honest labor. Sitting here in the absolute pristine silence of my heavily fortified estate, miles away from the noise and greed of the city, I finally understood the true depth of Evelyn's dying wish. When my beautiful wife begged me to protect Jada, she was not asking me to write blank checks to cover her mistakes. She was asking me to protect our daughter's soul. And the only way to save someone whose soul has been entirely corrupted by greed is to strip away every single material possession they idolize. I had to become the villain in her story so she could finally face the consequences of her own reality. I had to protect myself to truly honor the legacy of the family Evelyn and I had built. People in my social circle, the few trusted friends who actually knew the full extent of this saga, often asked me if I felt a lingering sense of guilt. They asked if a father could truly sleep at night, knowing his only child was scrubbing biological waste off the floors of a rundown 24-hour diner just to survive. My answer was always an unwavering, absolute yes. There is a dangerous misconception in our society that familial blood demands unconditional, endless forgiveness. People believe that no matter how severely a relative abuses you, betrays you, or tries to destroy you, you are fundamentally obligated to offer them a second chance. I utterly reject that philosophy. There is no cheap grace in my house. When a grown woman actively stands by and screams insults at her elderly father while he is bleeding on the hardwood floor, the social contract of family is permanently incinerated. I do not owe Jada a dramatic, tearful reunion. I will not secretly mail cash to her dingy studio apartment. Brad is exactly where he belongs, counting the days in a concrete federal prison cell, and Jada is exactly where she needs to be, learning the brutal, unforgiving value of a single dollar earned through physical pain. Meanwhile, I have completely secured my legacy. Yesterday afternoon, Richard Thorne officially finalized the restructuring of my entire financial portfolio. The impenetrable blind trusts have been permanently locked. When my time on this earth eventually comes to an end, my staggering 8-figure commercial wealth will not be inherited by a spoiled, entitled heir. Every single dime is legally mandated to be distributed to urban trade schools, providing full-ride scholarships for hardworking minority students who want to learn how to weld, build, and create honest infrastructure. My life's work will empower the next generation of builders, completely bypassing the greedy hands of those who only know how to consume. My phone vibrated softly against the polished surface of the dining table. The screen lit up with a brief encrypted text message from Richard Thorne. The final asset protection transfers are fully complete and legally binding. The message read, "No one can ever touch a single cent of your money. Enjoy the morning, Leon." I did not reply. I simply locked the screen and placed the device face down on the wood. I reached out and picked up my favorite ceramic mug, feeling the intense, comforting heat radiating against my heavily scarred palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee, letting the robust flavor wake up my senses. I stood up from the repaired oak chair, walked across the pristine living room, and stepped out through the sliding glass doors onto the expansive cedar deck. The crisp, clean morning air filled my lungs. I walked right up to the heavy wooden railing and looked out across the perfectly flat glass-like surface of the private lake. The water mirrored the bright blue sky above, completely undisturbed and wonderfully silent. I smiled a deep, quiet, and profoundly unshakable smile. Sometimes to rebuild a house, you have to let the rot burn itself to the ground. Looking back at this entire ordeal, the greatest lesson I learned is that blind generosity can easily become the architect of entitlement. We naturally want to shield our children from the hardships we faced. However, when we provide endless financial safety nets, we accidentally strip them of the opportunity to develop resilience and basic human decency. True love does not mean financing a toxic lifestyle or accepting blatant disrespect simply because you share the same bloodline. Sometimes the most profound act of love is to completely remove your support and allow the harsh reality of the world to teach them the lessons you no longer can. If you agree that respect should never be sacrificed for toxic family loyalty, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.